What if not all gray aliens are the same? Most people imagine grays as small beings with large heads and black eyes, but some encounter reports describe a much taller version, known as the tall grays. So are short grays and tall grays two different alien species? Or are they part of the same mysterious race? Some theories claim short grays are workers or biological drones, while tall grays may act as leaders, observers, or controllers. But is there any real difference behind these reports, or just different versions of the same alien legend? In this video, we break down the mystery of short grays versus tall grays. There is a moment in the study of the unexplained where the neat categories fall apart. For most of the 20th century, anyone willing to take the subject of alien contact seriously was at least working from a shared baseline. The beings most commonly reported by those who claimed contact with non-human intelligence were small, gray-skinned, large-headed, and black-eyed. They were the grays. They were, in the popular imagination and in much of the serious literature, a single unified species, one kind of being, one agenda, one source. That consensus, fragile as it always was, began to crack the moment researchers started reading the testimony more carefully. The crack appeared not in the sensational tabloid accounts, not in the Hollywood productions, not in the breathless radio broadcasts that turned the subject into entertainment. It appeared in the transcripts. It appeared in the hypnotic regression sessions conducted by trained professionals. It appeared in the detailed written accounts submitted by individuals who had no connection to one another, who lived in different countries, who had encountered these beings in different decades, and who described, with a consistency that could not be explained by cultural contamination alone, not one kind of gray-skinned being, but two, sometimes more, the short ones and the tall ones, the workers and the directors, the drones and the leaders. Or perhaps, if the more radical researchers were right, two entirely distinct biological entities that had simply been lumped together because they shared a superficial resemblance. This documentary exists because that question has never been properly answered. It exists because the answer, whatever it turns out to be, carries implications that reach far beyond the study of unidentified aerial phenomena or close encounters. If the short grays and the tall grays are the same species at different points in a biological life cycle, then what we are looking at is a single alien intelligence with a complex internal hierarchy. If they are two different species, then the question of their relationship becomes one of the most important and unsettling questions in the entire field. Are they allies? Are they masters and servants? Are they competing intelligences, both interested in the human species for their own reasons? And if they are two different species, the follow-on question is perhaps even more alarming. How many others might there be? We are going to take this question seriously. That means examining the testimony record, which spans 8 decades and multiple continents. It means looking at the biological and physiological differences reported between the two types. It means examining what the beings actually do in the encounter reports, and whether their behaviors align with or contradict a single species model. It means looking at what the whistleblowers and intelligence insiders have claimed, understanding that their testimony must be evaluated carefully and critically. It means examining the few physical traces that have been connected to these encounters, however contested those traces remain. And it means sitting with the philosophical weight of what different answers would actually mean for our understanding of ourselves and our place in whatever is really going on. Before we get to the modern testimony, we need to understand the historical arc of how these beings entered human awareness. Because the Greys did not appear fully formed in 1947 with the crash at Roswell, or even in 1961 with the Betty and Barney Hill abduction. They have antecedents. They have predecessors in the encounter literature that stretch back much further than the modern UFO era. And understanding those antecedents tells us something important about whether what people are describing is a stable, consistent phenomenon or a cultural construct that evolved over time. The modern era of gray alien reports begins formally in the early 1960s, but the seed was planted years earlier. In September of 1961, Betty and Barney Hill were driving home through the White Mountains of New Hampshire when they encountered what they described as a craft that paced their vehicle. descended toward them, and ultimately resulted in a period of missing time. Under hypnotic regression conducted by psychiatrist Benjamin Simon, both Betty and Barney described being taken aboard a craft and examined by beings that, in Barney's account in particular, were small, had large wraparound eyes, and communicated without speaking aloud. Betty's account included slightly different beings. She described what appeared to be a leader figure who was taller and seemed to be in command, while the others, smaller and more uniformly featured, carried out the examination. Neither Betty nor Barney was aware of the alien gray as a cultural icon at the time of their encounter. The gray as a recognizable popular image did not exist yet. They were describing something before it had been described. That detail matters enormously. One of the persistent criticisms of alien encounter testimony is that witnesses are simply producing culturally expected imagery, that people describe grays because they have seen grays in films and magazines and television programs, and their minds, under stress or in hypnosis, generate that familiar template. The Hill case predates the template. It is the template's origin point, or one of them. And within that origin point, right at the very beginning of the modern gray encounter record, there are already two distinct types of being described. The implications of this early bifurcation were not immediately understood. The Hill case became famous, was extensively studied, and extensively debated, but the focus fell primarily on the mechanics of the abduction, the reality of the missing time, the star map that Betty drew from memory during her hypnotic sessions, a map that researcher Marjorie Fish later identified as a plausible representation of the Zeta Reticuli star system. The distinction between the beings, the slight but definite difference in height and apparent authority between the leader and the others, was noted but not pursued with the rigor it deserved. That pursuit would come later, as the abduction phenomenon accelerated through the 1970s and 1980s, as researchers like Bud Hopkins, David Jacobs, and John Mack began accumulating case files that eventually numbered in the thousands. As those files grew, a pattern emerged that was too consistent across too many independent witnesses to be dismissed as coincidence or contamination. The small beings, typically described as between 3.5 and 4.5 feet tall, with large heads, vestigial noses and mouths, elongated fingers, and the enormous black eyes that would become the defining image of the alien gray in popular culture, were almost always present in numbers. They were the ones who moved the witness from their bed or their car or wherever they happened to be. They were the ones who conducted the physical examinations, who operated the instruments, who positioned and repositioned the human subject on the examination table. They carried out tasks. They were, in the language most witnesses eventually settled on, workers. And then, in a significant percentage of cases, not all, but enough to constitute a strong pattern, there was another figure, taller, significantly taller, in many accounts reaching 5 to 6 feet or even more, with the same large head and dark eyes, but with features that seemed somehow more defined, more individual, sometimes described as having a slightly different skin texture or color. This figure did not perform the examination. This figure observed. Sometimes this figure communicated directly with the witness, verbally or telepathically, in ways the small beings did not. Sometimes this figure made decisions that the small beings then carried out. In the language witnesses most commonly used for this figure, it was in charge. The question is what this means. Two categories of explanation have dominated the debate. The first is hierarchical. These are the same species, and the taller beings are a leadership caste, an older developmental stage, or a more evolved subgroup within a single biological and social framework. The second is taxonomic. These are genuinely different species that share a physical environment and possibly an agenda, but are biologically distinct entities. A third explanation, less popular but advanced by some researchers, is that the small beings are not biological at all, that they are engineered constructs, biological robots, or clones created by the taller beings to serve as a labor force. Each of these explanations has evidence in its favor. Each has evidence against it. Sorting through that evidence is what this documentary is for. To understand why this question is so difficult to resolve, it helps to understand the nature of the evidence available. The primary source material consists of human testimony. Most of that testimony was elicited under hypnotic regression, which introduces its own well-documented complications. The human mind under hypnosis is highly suggestible, capable of producing vivid and internally consistent false memories, and responsive to subtle cues from the hypnotist. This does not mean that hypnotically recovered memories are always, or even usually, fabricated, but it means that such memories cannot be accepted uncritically. Researchers like Jacobs were aware of this problem and worked to develop standardized protocols that minimized leading questions and suggestive framing. Others were less careful. The result is a testimony record that ranges from very carefully gathered to deeply compromised, and distinguishing between the two requires close attention to methodology. There is also a subset of encounter accounts that were not recovered under hypnosis, cases where the witness had conscious waking recall of their experience without any therapeutic intervention. These cases are in some ways more reliable as testimony, though they bring their own complications. Witnesses with waking recall may have had partial or distorted perceptions, may have been in altered states of consciousness for reasons unrelated to alien contact, and face the same cultural contamination problem as anyone reporting within the modern UFO era. But when waking recall accounts and hypnotically recovered accounts converge on the same physical descriptions, the same behavioral patterns, the same distinction between short workers and tall directors, the convergence becomes harder to explain away. Physical evidence is sparse but not non-existent. Alleged implant materials recovered from encounter witnesses have been analyzed by several laboratories with varying results. Some analyses found materials of unusual isotopic ratios suggesting origins outside the normal range of terrestrial manufacturing. Others found no anomalies. The chain of custody for most such materials is impossible to verify completely, which limits how much weight they can carry. Photographs and videos of alleged encounters are almost universally low quality, ambiguous, or demonstrably fake. The craft associated with gray encounters have been photographed and filmed extensively, but the beings themselves are never captured clearly on any image that has survived serious scrutiny. What we are left with, then, is a large and internally consistent body of human testimony, a small and contested body of physical trace evidence, and a set of theoretical frameworks that attempt to make sense of what people are reporting. It is not nothing. In a court of law, the testimony of hundreds of independent witnesses describing the same events in the same terms would constitute significant evidentiary weight, even without physical corroboration. The fact that these witnesses described two distinct types of beings consistently across decades and continents is a data point that deserves examination. Let us begin that examination with the physical descriptions themselves. What exactly do witnesses report seeing when they describe the short grays? The short gray, let us call this type 1 for clarity, understanding that this terminology is our analytical convenience, not an alien classification system, is the more commonly reported entity. It appears in encounter after encounter, described with remarkable consistency by witnesses who have no knowledge of each other's accounts. The typical height falls between 3.5 and 4.5 feet, with the majority of descriptions clustering around 4 feet. The head is described as large relative to body size, roughly triangular or teardrop-shaped when viewed from the front, with the widest point at the top and the face tapering to a small pointed chin. The cranium itself is smooth, without visible hair, and often described as slightly translucent at the temples, as though the skull beneath is visible. The eyes are the feature most consistently described and most often depicted in popular representations. They are large, very large, and wrap around the sides of the head in a way that suggests a field of vision significantly wider than the human approximately 180-degree range. The eyes are uniformly dark, described most often as black or very deep brown, without a visible distinction between iris and pupil, and sometimes described as having a slightly reflective quality, like polished obsidian or wet stone. Witnesses frequently report that looking directly into the eyes of a gray produces a strong physical and psychological response, a sensation of being examined at depth, of having one's thoughts accessed or read, of experiencing something that is both communication and violation simultaneously. This response is reported far more consistently for the small grays than for the taller ones, which is interesting, and may indicate something about the function of those eyes in the interaction between the beings and their human subjects. The nose of type 1 is described as vestigial at best, two small slits or nostrils set slightly above center on the face without a protruding nasal structure. The mouth is thin, a narrow horizontal line, and is rarely described as opening for speech. Communication from these beings is almost universally reported as telepathic or as a form of direct mental impression, a sense of receiving information or commands without any physical production of sound. When witnesses do describe sound from these beings, it is usually described as high, almost beyond the range of hearing, like a tone or a vibration rather than a voice. The body of type 1 is thin, almost uniformly thin, with limbs that appear fragile relative to their length. The arms are often described as long enough that the hands reach to approximately knee height when the being stands straight. The hands have 3 or 4 fingers. The number varies between accounts, and this variation has itself been the subject of significant debate, with some researchers suggesting it indicates multiple subtypes within what has been classified as a single type. The fingers are elongated, sometimes described as slightly tapered toward the tip. There are no visible knuckle joints in many descriptions, and the fingers appear to have a flexibility and range of motion beyond what human finger joints allow. There is no visible thumbnail or nail structure in the majority of accounts, though some witnesses describe a slight ridge at the fingertip. The skin of type 1 is gray, obviously given the name. But the gray is not a uniform color. It ranges from a light, almost white gray in some accounts to a darker, more bluish gray in others. The texture is described as smooth, almost waxy, without visible pores, without hair anywhere on the body. Some witnesses describe the skin as having a slight luminescence, as though it generates or transmits a faint light. Others describe it as matte, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. The temperature of the skin, when witnesses describe physical contact with these beings, is consistently described as cool, not cold enough to be alarming, but noticeably below normal human body temperature. The legs are short relative to the torso, giving these beings a slightly top-heavy appearance. They move in most accounts with an economy and precision that witnesses find disconcerting, not because the movement is jerky or mechanical, but because it is too smooth. There is no wasted motion. There is no expression of emotion in their physical behavior. They do what they are doing completely, and then they do the next thing. The effect, witnesses say, is like watching something very efficient and very purposeful and very indifferent to you as a person, even as it interacts with your body in intimate ways. Now consider type 2, the tall gray. The tall gray appears less frequently in the encounter record, but its appearances are concentrated in a specific part of the encounter narrative, the parts that involve direct communication, decision-making, and what witnesses often describe as the most psychologically impactful moments of their experience. The height of type 2 is most commonly reported between 5 and 6 feet, with some accounts reaching 6.5 feet. The figure is thin, in keeping with the general gray morphology, but less uniformly thin than type 1. Some witnesses describe the tall gray as having slightly more pronounced physical proportions, though still within a range that would look fragile by human standards. The head of type 2 is large, as with type 1, but the proportional relationship between the head and the body appears somewhat different. Because the body is taller, the head does not appear quite as dramatically oversized, though it remains clearly outside the range of human proportions. The face of type 2 is described by many witnesses as having slightly more defined features. The nose, while still vestigial, is sometimes described as having a slight ridge or protrusion that type 1 lacks. The mouth is similarly thin, but may be slightly larger, and some witnesses report seeing the tall gray move its mouth during what was experienced as telepathic communication, as though the physical act of speaking is an atavistic reflex that has not been fully suppressed. The eyes of type 2 are described with the same core characteristics as type 1, large, dark, wraparound, but witnesses who have encountered both types in the same experience often note a qualitative difference that is difficult to articulate. Several witnesses have described the eyes of the tall gray as having more depth, as being somehow less opaque than those of the short gray, as giving the impression of a mind behind them that is more engaged with you as an individual rather than as a subject. This impression may reflect the difference in how the two types interact with human witnesses, but it may also reflect a genuine physiological difference in the eye structure. The hands of type 2 are described in the same general terms as type 1, but are larger, proportional to the body, and some witnesses note that they appear more capable, more expressive in their movement, more used for deliberate gesture. The skin of type 2 is described with the same gray tonality as type 1, but several witnesses describe a slightly different texture, less uniformly smooth, occasionally described as having very fine, barely perceptible surface markings, like a texture woven into the skin rather than painted over it. Behaviorally, the differences between the two types are as consistent as the physical differences, and in some ways more significant. Type 1 beings do the work of the encounter. They move the witness, position the witness, operate instruments, take samples, insert and remove implants, and perform whatever physical procedures are part of the experience. They do all of this with complete efficiency and without any apparent concern for the witness's comfort, fear, or distress. They do not offer reassurance. They do not explain themselves. They respond to resistance with what witnesses describe as effortless neutralization, a simple touch or a direct gaze that dissolves the impulse to fight or flee. They are, in the most literal sense, workers. Whether they are workers by biology, by social conditioning, or by design is one of the central questions this documentary will examine. Type 2. Beings observe. They observe the examination, they observe the witness, and at a certain point in many encounters, they become directly involved, not to perform physical procedures, but to communicate. The communication takes several forms. In some accounts, it is purely mental, a direct transmission of information or impression without any external indication that communication is happening. In other accounts, the tall gray speaks, or appears to speak, though witnesses often describe the experience of hearing this speech as taking place somewhere between the outer ear and the mind, as though the sound is being generated inside the witness's head rather than in the external environment. What the tall gray communicates is consistently more complex, more personalized, and more emotionally weighted than any communication from type 1. The tall gray explains, or attempts to explain. The tall gray instructs. The tall gray sometimes comforts, or attempts comfort, or produces something that has the emotional effect of comfort, even when the words or impressions being transmitted are not inherently comforting. Most significantly, the tall gray is the one who, in accounts where witnesses are given information about the purpose or context of what is happening to them, delivers that information. It is the tall gray who speaks of programs, of purposes, of futures. It is the tall gray who tells witnesses that what is being done to them is necessary or important or part of something larger than any individual. Whether those statements are truthful, whether the tall gray is a reliable narrator of its own agenda, is a question that researchers have debated intensely and that we will explore in detail. But the fact that these statements come from the tall gray and not from the short ones is itself a consistent pattern that has implications for what we believe about the relationship between the two types. This is the baseline. This is what the testimony record establishes as the starting point for any serious inquiry into whether short grays and tall grays are the same species. We have two physical types, consistently described across decades of independent testimony. We have two behavioral profiles that align with the physical distinction. We have a hierarchical structure implicit in almost every account that places the tall gray above the short one. What we do not have yet is an explanation. The explanation requires understanding not just what these beings look like and what they do, but what they might be. And for that, we need to think carefully about the biology, or more precisely, about what the human-reported descriptions imply about the biology of these beings, assuming for the purposes of this analysis that the descriptions have some relationship to physical reality. That analysis begins in the next part of this documentary, where we will examine the physiological evidence and what it tells us about the evolutionary or developmental origins of the gray phenotype. But before we go there, it is worth pausing on something that has been implicit in everything said so far: the sheer consistency of the reports. Over the course of 8 decades of intensive documentation of gray encounter claims, researchers have cataloged thousands of cases from dozens of countries. The witnesses come from every demographic, every educational level, every cultural background. They include farmers and physicians, children and military personnel, people who were enthusiastic believers in extraterrestrial life before their experience, and people who were committed skeptics. They describe, with variations in detail that are precisely what you would expect from independent witnesses to the same phenomenon, and precisely what you would not expect from people fabricating accounts based on shared cultural imagery, the same two types of beings, not exactly the same. There is individual variation within each type, as you would expect if these are biological entities and not uniform constructs, but the same pattern, always the smaller ones doing the work, almost always a taller one present when information is being communicated, always the hierarchy, always the division of labor. The skeptic's response to this consistency has evolved over time. The earliest critical response was that there were no consistent descriptions, that encounter reports varied wildly, and that the gray image was a fabrication by sensation-seeking reporters and publicity-hungry claimants. That response became untenable as the documented case files grew and the consistency became undeniable. The response shifted. Yes, there is consistency, but the consistency is explained by cultural contamination. Witnesses are producing descriptions that match cultural templates because those templates exist and the human imagination defaults to the familiar. This remains the dominant skeptical position, and it has genuine merit as a concern. But it does not explain the Hill case, which preceded the template. It does not explain cases documented in rural areas of South America and Africa and Asia by witnesses who had no access to North American UFO culture. It does not explain the specific behavioral distinction between the two types, which is not a prominent feature of popular UFO culture and is not something that would be generated by simple exposure to gray imagery. The consistency, in other words, needs an explanation. The skeptic's explanation is cultural. The believer's explanation is literal. This documentary is attempting something harder than either. It is attempting to analyze the evidence on its own terms, follow where it leads, and arrive at a conclusion about the single species versus two species question that is supported by the best available evidence, whatever that evidence is. With that methodological commitment established, let us move to the science. What the body tells us. Biology, physiology, and the gray phenotype. Science does not officially study alien physiology. There is no peer-reviewed literature on gray biology, no university department conducting comparative anatomy between short and tall extraterrestrials, no research grant funding the investigation of whether beings described by thousands of human witnesses represent one species or two. This is not because the question is unimportant. It is because the subject is institutionally radioactive. Academics who engage seriously with the physical reality of alien contact risk their funding, their tenure, their professional reputation, and their standing in their field. A small number have done it anyway. Their work and the rigorous analysis of the testimony record that others have conducted from outside institutional frameworks gives us something to work with. What follows is not official science. It is analysis. Careful, cautious analysis of what the reported physical characteristics of both gray types would imply about their biology, assuming those reports have a relationship to physical reality. This kind of analysis has been conducted before, most notably by researchers like Dr. Roger Leir, who spent decades recovering and analyzing alleged implant materials from encounter witnesses, and by independent researchers who who have applied principles of evolutionary biology and comparative anatomy to the testimony record. We are building on that work and extending it. Start with the most fundamental question. Could the physical body described for the gray type exist as a functional biological organism? The gray phenotype, a large skull housing a large brain, a thin and apparently fragile body, vestigial sensory organs for smell, taste, and hearing, enormously developed visual organs, is not biologically impossible. It is, in fact, consistent with one well-understood trajectory of evolution. Consider the principle of encephalization. The tendency in many terrestrial evolutionary lineages for brain size to increase relative to body mass over time. In hominid evolution, this encephalization produced the modern human brain, which is 3 times the volume of the brain of our Australopithecine ancestors. If this process continued beyond the human endpoint, if another 1 million or 5 million years of selection pressure for cognitive capacity further enlarged the brain and further reduced the allocation of biological resources to other systems, you would produce something that looks remarkably like what witnesses describe. The large skull of the gray is the accommodation for a large brain. The large eyes, with their apparent capacity for superior light gathering and wide visual fields, would be selected for in an organism whose primary interface with its environment is visual rather than olfactory or auditory, consistent with the reduction of the nose and ear structures. The thin body, with its apparently reduced musculature, would be consistent with a species that long ago abandoned the need for physical strength as a survival tool, relying instead on technology and cognitive capacity. The cool skin temperature would be consistent with a reduced metabolic rate, which would in turn be consistent with a brain that has evolved extremely efficient operation. Something like a supercomputer that runs cold rather than a less efficient system that generates waste heat. None of this proves that the grays exist. It simply establishes that the physical form described is not biologically nonsensical. It is, in fact, consistent with a plausible evolutionary trajectory for a species that separated from a common ancestor millions of years earlier than our own branch and continued along the encephalization pathway longer. This argument was first made systematically by Whitley Strieber in his analysis of his own encounter experiences, and it has been developed and extended by several other researchers. It is not conclusive, but it is one data point in favor of the testimony having some relationship to physical reality. People are not generally describing biological impossibilities. Now apply this framework to the distinction between type 1 and type 2. If both types are members of the same species, what would explain the significant difference in height while maintaining the same general morphological characteristics? Several biological models are possible. The first is sexual dimorphism. Males and females of the same species can differ significantly in size, and in most terrestrial species where size dimorphism exists, it is the male that is larger. If type 2 represents one sex and type 1 the other, the height difference is biologically unremarkable. However, sexual dimorphism in humans and most other terrestrial species is typically accompanied by other physical differences. In human terms, facial structure, fat distribution, skeletal proportions, and witnesses do not consistently describe meaningful physical differences between the two types beyond height and the subtle facial feature variations noted earlier. They are not describing clearly male and female beings. They are describing two beings that look like members of the same type, but at different scales. The second single-species model is a caste system with biological underpinning, a species that, through either natural selection or deliberate genetic engineering, produces distinct biological subtypes fulfilling distinct social functions. This is not without terrestrial precedent. Eusocial insects, bees, ants, termites, produce individuals of dramatically different morphology from the same genetic blueprint, with queens, workers, soldiers, and drones that look and function completely differently despite being members of the same species. The analogy is imperfect in several ways. Eusocial insects are invertebrates. Their caste differentiation is driven by environmental signals during development, and the cognitive complexity of ant workers is obviously far below what would be required for the behaviors described for type 1 grays. But the principle that a single species can produce distinct biological subtypes for distinct functional roles is established. If the gray species produces two morphological subtypes, one for intellectual and command functions and one for physical operational functions, the taller subtype would logically be the one with more developed cognitive equipment, consistent with the behavioral description of type 2 as the communicator, the decision maker, the one who explains and instructs. The shorter subtype would be optimized for the physical work of whatever program these beings are conducting, with enhanced physical dexterity and sensory equipment suited to their tasks. This model is internally consistent and does not require us to posit two separate species. The third single-species model is developmental. Type 1 represents a younger individual and Type 2 an older one, with significant growth occurring throughout the lifespan and with the behavioral and social role of an individual correlated with their developmental stage. This model has the advantage of not requiring biological caste differentiation, which would represent a significant evolutionary commitment, but it has a serious problem. Witnesses who describe both types in the same encounter do not typically describe a continuous range of sizes. They describe small ones and tall ones, without individuals at intermediate heights. If development were the explanation, you would expect some witnesses to describe beings at various points along the growth curve. Instead, the size distribution is bimodal, two clusters, not a continuum. Against all three single-species models, the strongest evidence is the behavioral consistency. If sexual dimorphism were the explanation, you would expect encounter accounts to occasionally feature groups composed entirely of one type, or to feature interaction patterns that reflect sexual differentiation. They do not. If developmental stage were the explanation, you would expect encounter accounts to occasionally feature what appear to be juvenile beings learning from older ones, or to feature contexts that suggest the relationship between small and tall is one of maturation rather than authority. They do not. If biological caste were the explanation, you would expect the two types to be essentially interchangeable in terms of cognitive function, with the taller type simply assigned a different role. But the taller type is not described as a differently assigned worker. It is described as a genuinely different kind of mind. This brings us to the two-species hypothesis, which holds that Type 1 and Type 2 are biologically distinct organisms that share a common operational environment for purposes that remain unclear. What would this mean biologically? It would mean that two separate evolutionary lineages produced organisms with superficially similar morphologies, an example of convergent evolution, which is a well-established phenomenon on Earth. Consider that dolphins and sharks are completely unrelated from an evolutionary standpoint, but share very similar body plans, both having been shaped by the same environmental pressures of aquatic locomotion. If the pressures of intelligence, technology dependence, and whatever selective environment these beings inhabited pushed two separate lineages toward the encephalized, large-eyed, smooth-skinned gray phenotype, convergent evolution could explain why they look similar without being the same. The differences in the physical descriptions, the taller height, the slightly more defined facial features, the subtly different skin texture described for Type 2 would, under the two-species model, represent the residual morphological differences between two distinct evolutionary histories. The differences are real but subtle, perhaps because both species have been in each other's presence for a very long time and have co-evolved in ways that reinforced the superficial similarities, or perhaps simply because the same selective pressures independently produced similar but not identical results. There is a version of the two-species hypothesis that is considerably darker than simple convergent evolution. Some researchers, drawing on a subset of encounter accounts that include explicit or implicit communication from the beings themselves, have suggested that Type 1 is not a naturally evolved species at all, that it is, instead, a manufactured species, a biological construct created by Type 2 or by some third party for operational purposes. The language witnesses use for this hypothesis most commonly frames it as cloning. Type 1 beings described by witnesses in communication with Type 2 as having been produced rather than born, as existing in a relationship to Type 2 that is one of creation to creator rather than species peer to species peer. This hypothesis is the most extreme and the most difficult to evaluate. It would explain the complete behavioral and apparent emotional differentiation between the two types. Type 1's absence of individual personality, its machine-like efficiency, its apparent lack of fear or curiosity or any effective response, as the product of design rather than evolution. A designed organism optimized for a specific function would not need an emotional range. It would not need individuality. It would not need the kind of self-aware inner life that appears in the encounter accounts to be present in Type 2 and absent in Type 1. The claim that Type 1 is a biological robot is extreme, but it is not incoherent. The physical evidence that might theoretically distinguish between these models is limited by what can actually be recovered and analyzed from encounter experiences. The most relevant physical evidence comes from two sources: the tissue samples and materials alleged to have been collected at crash sites, and the implant materials recovered from encounter witnesses. Both categories of evidence carry significant problems of chain of custody and verification, but they represent the only physical trace material currently available for analysis. The alleged biological material from crash sites is the more contested category. The claims go back to Roswell in 1947, where several witnesses described the recovery of biological entities from a crashed craft. The accounts of those entities have themselves reflected the same bifurcation noted in the abduction testimony. Some descriptions are of small beings, 3 to 4 feet tall, consistent with Type 1. Some descriptions are of a taller being, sometimes described as a survivor rather than a casualty of the crash, which matches the general description of Type 2. The biological material allegedly recovered from crash sites has never been made publicly available for independent analysis, and the chain of custody, even for the testimony about that material, is deeply compromised by decades of government denial and counter-disclosure operations. What we have from this category of evidence is suggestive and maddeningly difficult to use. The implant materials are slightly more tractable. Dr. Roger Lear and his colleagues surgically removed nearly 24 objects from the bodies of people who reported encounter experiences, objects that were located in positions consistent with witness descriptions of where implants had been placed, that were surrounded by anomalous tissue responses inconsistent with standard foreign body reactions, and that in several cases exhibited unusual material properties when analyzed. The University of New Mexico and other institutions conducted analyses on some of these materials. The results were mixed. Some of the objects were found to be terrestrial materials, possibly simple foreign body intrusions with no connection to the encounter reports. Others showed isotopic ratios that were outside the range expected for materials produced by terrestrial industrial processes, with a distribution pattern more consistent with materials of meteoric origin. But meteoric origin is not the same as extraterrestrial biological origin, and the jump from unusual isotopic ratios to alien implants is substantial. None of the recovered implant materials directly addressed the question of single versus double species. If implants were placed by both Type 1 and Type 2 beings, and if the implants placed by each type were chemically or structurally distinct, analysis of multiple implants might show clustering consistent with two manufacturing sources. This analysis was never conducted systematically, partly because of the limitations of the recovery record, and partly because the researchers who were in a position to do it died or ceased their work before it could be completed. What we are left with, then, is the physical testimony, the descriptions of the beings' bodies, and what biological reasoning can extract from those descriptions. Let us push that reasoning further by examining two specific physical characteristics that may be more diagnostically useful than they initially appear: the eyes and the hands. The eyes of both gray types are described as large, dark, and without visible distinction between iris and pupil. This description is consistent with eyes adapted for gathering maximum light in conditions of low illumination. Large pupils that remain permanently dilated, covering most of the visible eye surface, with an iris reduced to a thin or non-existent ring around the pupil. This adaptation would make the eyes extremely sensitive to light, but would also mean, as some witnesses have noted, that these beings appear very uncomfortable in bright light and are never encountered in direct sunlight. Encounters typically occur at night or in the low-light interior of a craft. The eye adaptation, if real, would explain this consistently reported feature of the encounter phenomenology. Now, if both types have this same eye structure, does that support single species or two species? It could support either. If the two types are the same species, shared eye structure is expected. If the two types are convergently evolved separate species, they might independently have developed the same adaptation if they shared an environment or an evolutionary history involving similar light conditions. But here is where a small detail in the testimony becomes potentially significant. Some witnesses who have encountered both types in the same experience describe a subtle difference in the eyes. Type 1 eyes are described as more uniformly dark, more opaque, more like polished lenses. Type 2 eyes are described as having slightly more depth, occasionally as having a faint coloration, deep brown or very dark green, visible within the overall darkness. This is consistent with a structural difference in the eye. Type 2 eyes may have more of a visible iris, or the reflective tapetum layer that gives some animal eyes their shine may function differently in Type 2 than Type 1. If this difference is real and consistent, it supports a distinction between the two types that goes below the surface. The hands are equally informative. The most commonly reported finger count for Type 1 is 3 fingers plus a thumb, or 4 fingers without an obvious thumb analog. For Type 2, the most common description is also in this range, but with slightly more variation. Some witnesses describe Type 2 as having longer, more individually differentiated fingers, occasionally even noting what appear to be slight variations in finger length that give the hand a more distinct visual signature, similar to the way human hands are individually recognizable in ways that, say, bird feet are not. If Type 2 hands are more morphologically differentiated than Type 1 hands, this would be consistent with a being that uses its hands for more complex and varied tasks, or with a being that evolved from a more manually dexterous ancestral stock. None of this is definitive. All of it depends on taking the testimony record at face value, which requires bracketing the deep epistemological problems with that record. But the pattern is there, and the pattern has internal consistency, and the internal consistency of the biological implications deserves to be part of any serious evaluation of the single versus double species question. There is one more biological consideration that has not been adequately addressed in the existing literature, and it concerns reproduction. If the biological hybridization program described in a large subset of encounter accounts is real, if these beings are actually engaged in the production of hybrid offspring between their genetics and human genetics, then the question of whether they are one species or two has direct implications for the biology of that program. In straightforward biological terms, hybridization is most effective between closely related species and becomes progressively less feasible as the genetic distance between the parent species increases. If Type 1 and Type 2 are the same species, then a hybridization program involving human genetics would be conducted by a single species operating with a unified biological platform. If they are two separate species, the hybridization program becomes more complex. Either only one of them is biologically engaged with human genetics, or both are pursuing parallel programs with different biological goals, or the hybrid offspring they might produce would be genetically distinct depending on which type contributed the non-human material. Witnesses who describe being told about the hybridization program, virtually always by Type 2, not by Type 1, describe it in terms of a long-term project to produce beings that carry characteristics of both human and gray biology. The purpose given for this project varies: preservation of a dying gray species, creation of a bridge between two biological platforms, development of beings with capacities that neither pure human nor pure gray possesses. These explanations are offered by the beings themselves, which means they carry all the problems of relying on the alien's own account of its agenda, but the biological detail embedded in the accounts, the claim that the process is technically difficult, that early hybrid generations were not viable, that the project has required multiple generations of refinement, is consistent with what we know about interspecies hybridization on Earth. Mules are viable, horses and donkeys having diverged recently enough to share sufficient chromosomal compatibility. Tiger-lion hybrids can be produced but are typically sterile. The further apart two species are genetically, the more problematic hybridization becomes. If the beings claiming to conduct this hybridization program are two separate species, then either they share genetic compatibility with each other and with humans, which would be remarkable and would suggest either shared ancestry or extraordinary genetic engineering capability, or the program is being conducted by one of them, with the other present as a collaborator or observer. The behavioral distinction between the two types in encounter accounts involving reproduction-related procedures is consistent with the latter. It is the small beings who physically conduct the reproductive procedures, while the tall beings observe and communicate. If only one of them is genetically engaged with the human reproductive system, it would logically be the type conducting the procedures. This line of reasoning does not definitively establish that the two types are different species, but it raises a question that the single species model has to answer. If both types are the same species, why is only one type conducting the physical reproductive procedures? In a single species model with a caste system, the answer might be simple: the workers do the work. But a species conducting one of the most sophisticated biological programs in any encounter account would not leave the most technically demanding tasks to individuals optimized for simple physical work. The level of biological manipulation described in abduction accounts involving reproduction is, by any measure, enormously sophisticated. The beings doing it should be the most cognitively capable, not the most drone-like. Unless Type 1 is not a drone in terms of cognitive capacity for biology, unless, in other words, the apparent simplicity and robotic quality of Type 1 masks a form of intelligence that is specifically biological in character, while Type 2 represents a different cognitive profile, one suited to language and abstract communication. This would be another version of the caste hypothesis. Not simple workers and smart directors, but two specialized intelligences, each highly capable within its domain. This version of the single-species model is more sophisticated and better fits the evidence, but it requires positing a level of biological specialization that goes considerably beyond anything seen in terrestrial species. We have now established the biological framework for evaluating the single versus double species question. The answer is not yet clear, but the question has been sharpened. In the next part of this documentary, we move from biology to behavior, from what these beings are to what they do, and what their actions tell us about their relationship to each other and to the humans they encounter. The architecture of the encounter, behavioral patterns, and what they reveal. Behavior is the most reliable biological data we have about these beings. Physical descriptions can be distorted by perception, by cultural expectation, by the altered states that witnesses frequently report experiencing during their encounters. But behavior, the sequence of actions, the assignment of tasks, the patterns of interaction, the hierarchy of decision-making, is harder to fabricate consistently across thousands of independent accounts without the underlying pattern being real. The behavioral record of gray encounters is extensive and, on the question of Type 1 versus Type 2 differentiation, remarkably consistent. To understand what the behavioral record tells us, we need to first understand the structure of a typical close encounter of the fourth kind, the abduction experience, because it is within this structured event that the behavioral differentiation between the two types is most clearly documented. The encounter follows a recognizable sequence. Not every encounter includes every element, and individual variations are common, but the overall architecture is consistent across cases. The encounter typically begins with some form of paralysis or incapacitation of the witness. This may occur in the witness's bedroom during a period that initially appears to be normal sleep, or it may occur in a vehicle or in an outdoor setting. The witness experiences a sudden inability to move voluntarily, a state that has been described both as physical restraint and as a kind of mental intervention that removes the will to move without affecting the physical capacity to do so. This is an important distinction. Witnesses generally do not describe being physically held down. They describe being unable to decide to move, as though the decision itself has been temporarily suspended. This suggests a neurological intervention rather than a physical one, and it is the first indication that what is being done to human witnesses is cognitively sophisticated. The beings present during this initial phase are almost always type 1, the small grays. They move the witness from wherever the witness is to wherever the examination will take place, sometimes physically, sometimes in ways that defy normal spatial logic, with witnesses describing being moved through walls or windows or rising vertically into the air without normal physical means. The small beings coordinate this movement efficiently, with the witness describing a sense of being handled like an object, moved with care but without warmth, repositioned when necessary, guided from one location to another in a process that appears to them to be entirely routine from the perspective of the beings conducting it. Aboard whatever environment the witness finds themselves in, most commonly described as a circular or oval room with a central examination table, smooth curved walls, indirect lighting that has no visible source, and a temperature that is typically described as cooler than comfortable, the physical examination begins. This examination is conducted exclusively by type 1 beings in the large majority of cases. They operate instruments that witnesses describe variously as small, handheld devices, larger mounted equipment, and in some cases, instruments that appear to be extensions of the being's own hands, structures that slide out from between their fingers or from the palm of the hand in a way that witnesses find particularly unsettling. The examination includes inspection of the eyes, ears, nose, throat, and skin, sampling of blood, tissue, and genetic material, manipulation of the reproductive system in a significant proportion of cases, and frequently the placement or inspection of what appears to be a small device in the nasal cavity, behind the ear, or elsewhere in the body. Throughout all of this, the type 1 beings communicate nothing, or almost nothing. They occasionally appear to communicate with each other through means the witness cannot perceive, with witnesses describing a sudden coordinated change in activity among the beings that suggests some form of signal has been transmitted without any observable exchange. They do not explain what they are doing. They do not ask for consent. They do not respond to verbal protests or physical resistance, except to neutralize resistance when it occurs. They are, in the witness's experience, as impersonal as a medical procedure conducted on an unconscious patient by a surgical team that has not been told to treat the patient as a person. At some point in the encounter, sometimes early, sometimes after the physical examination is complete, a different kind of being enters or becomes prominent, the tall gray. What happens after this presence is established varies considerably between cases, but the consistent element is that the encounter changes in character. The assembly line impersonality of the examination phase gives way to something that has at least the form of interaction between individuals. The tall gray looks at the witness looks at the tall gray, and something passes between them. Communication is the defining behavior of the tall gray. In virtually every case where type 2 appears, there is some form of information exchange that goes beyond the physical procedures conducted by type 1. This exchange takes several forms, ranging from a simple impression of calm or reassurance to detailed verbal or telepathic communication about the purpose of what is happening, the identity and origins of the beings conducting it, the nature of the relationship between these beings and the human species, and the implications of that relationship for the future. The complexity and specificity of what is communicated varies enormously. Some witnesses receive only a generalized impression of being known, of having a relationship to these beings that precedes this particular encounter. Others receive what amounts to a briefing, explicit information about a program, a timeline, a set of purposes. The content of these communications is, frankly, one of the most contested areas in the entire field of encounter research. We will examine it in detail in a later part of this documentary. What matters here is the behavioral aspect. The fact that communication of this kind comes from type 2 and not from type 1 in encounter after encounter, is a pattern so consistent that it must be structurally significant. Consider what this pattern implies about the internal organization of whatever operation is being conducted. If you are designing an operation that involves both complex logistics and complex communication, you assign your best communicators to the communication tasks. The tall gray is the communicator. If both types are members of the same species, the biological or social processes that produce the differentiation between them have also produced a differentiation in communicative function. The tall one is the face of the operation, in the most literal sense. The short ones are the hands. There is a specific subset of encounter accounts that bears particularly close examination on the question of behavioral differentiation, cases in which the witness has been able to observe what appears to be a direct interaction between the two types. In most encounters, the tall gray is present and the small ones are present, but they operate essentially independently, the small ones doing their work, the tall one conducting its communication, without any visible exchange between them. But in a smaller number of cases, witnesses describe what appears to be directive communication from the tall gray to the small ones. A gesture, a shift in the tall gray's focus, and the small beings change what they are doing. One of them stops an examination procedure and another takes over. One of them retrieves an instrument that another appeared to be about to use. The tall gray has communicated something to them, and they have acted on it. This directive behavior is the most direct evidence for a hierarchical relationship, but it does not in itself resolve the single versus two species question. A caste system within a single species could produce exactly this kind of hierarchy, but there is a quality to the described interaction that some witnesses find more difficult to categorize. The relationship between the tall gray and the small ones, as described by witnesses who have observed it, has an odd quality that several have reached for the same word to describe. Ownership, not command exactly, something closer to the relationship between a being that created or engineered something and the things it created or engineered. The tall gray does not interact with the small ones the way a manager interacts with subordinates. It interacts with them the way a programmer interacts with a program, issuing instructions in the expectation of execution, with no need for acknowledgement, no allowance for disagreement, no recognition of the small beings as independent agents who have chosen to obey. This may be a projection by witnesses, imposing a familiar framework on something fundamentally unfamiliar, but it appears in independent accounts with enough consistency to be noted. If it reflects something real about the relationship, it would support the manufactured Type 1 hypothesis. The small beings are not a lower caste of the same species. They are constructs, biological or otherwise, created by or for the tall ones, and the tall gray's relationship to them is not social, but operational. The behavioral evidence also includes something that has been largely overlooked in the literature: the emotional range, or apparent lack thereof, exhibited by each type. Witnesses who have experienced fear, distress, or physical pain during their encounters describe essentially no response from Type 1 beings to these emotional states. The small beings are not merely unsympathetic in the human sense of failing to show empathy. They appear to genuinely not register or respond to the emotional content of the human witness's experience. Pain produces no adjustment in procedure. Crying produces no pause or change of approach. Terror produces only the neutralizing response that removes resistance, after which the procedure continues unchanged. This is a behavioral profile that is, in its totality, unlike that of any known social animal on Earth. Social animals respond to distress signals from other individuals, even across species, which is why a human can calm a frightened horse or why a dog will comfort a crying child. The capacity for emotional responsiveness is deeply embedded in the biology of social creatures because it provides survival advantages for individuals living in groups. Type 1's absolute absence of this response suggests one of three things: that they are not a social species and never were, that they have evolved or engineered the capacity for emotional responsiveness out of their biology, or that they have no inner life in the relevant sense, and therefore no mechanism by which the emotional states of others could be meaningful to them. Each of these explanations is extraordinary, The first would mean that the most sophisticated operation any alien intelligence has ever been described as conducting is being carried out by a social beings who somehow developed civilization and technology without the social framework that, on Earth, appears to be a prerequisite for both. The second would mean that a species deliberately removed a core adaptive feature from its behavioral repertoire, which is a form of biological self-modification with implications that are staggering to contemplate. The third would mean that Type 1 is, effectively, not conscious in the sense we mean when we apply that word to beings capable of suffering or joy. Type 2, by contrast, does demonstrate something that witnesses interpret as emotional responsiveness, however alien that responsiveness may be. The tall gray in communication with a human witness appears to register the witness's fear and to respond to it, not always effectively, not in ways that always reduce the fear, but in ways that indicate the being is aware of the emotional state and has decided to engage with it. Some witnesses describe what they interpret as genuine concern from the tall gray, a sense that their distress matters to this being in some way that it does not matter to the small ones. Others describe what feels more like management of emotional state, an effort to keep the witness functional and cooperative, with the witness's comfort a means to an end rather than an end in itself. But even the managerial version of emotional engagement represents a qualitative difference from the complete absence of such engagement in Type 1. The implication for the single versus double species question is this: if you believe that consciousness and emotional responsiveness are properties that emerge from biological complexity, then the different levels of apparent emotional responsiveness between the two types would support a biological difference. If both types were the same species, you would expect some degree of shared emotional architecture, even if individuals varied. The difference between complete absence and evident presence of emotional responsiveness is not a variation along a spectrum. It is a categorical difference. Let us examine a specific case that illustrates this behavioral distinction in detail. In 1988, a woman identified in the literature as Karen Morgan, a pseudonym used by researcher David Jacobs in his book Secret Life, reported a series of encounters over more than a decade, beginning when she was a child. In her accounts, recovered through careful hypnotic regression by Jacobs with extensive protocol documentation, she describes multiple types of beings present in her encounters. The short ones, who she describes as clinical and impersonal, conducting the physical procedures of her encounters with complete efficiency and without any apparent awareness of her as an individual. And a taller being, which she describes as somehow different in presence, not warmer exactly, but more there, more individually present. She describes this being communicating with her directly on several occasions, sometimes providing explanations for what was happening, sometimes issuing what felt like instructions about how she was expected to behave, sometimes simply looking at her in a way that she could not fully explain, but that felt like genuine seeing, being seen as a specific person, not just as a subject. In one session, she describes asking the tall being directly why the small ones hurt her during a procedure. She reports receiving a response that was not an apology. It contained no apology, but that was an acknowledgement. The tall being communicated, in whatever mode it used, that her experience of the procedure was registered and was, in some sense, a cost rather than an irrelevance. The small beings, by contrast, had not paused, had not changed what they were doing, and gave no indication of having registered her question at all. Two types of beings, in the same room, conducting what appeared to be the same operation, with a profound difference in the quality of their presence. Case after case in the literature shows this same structure. The small beings work. The tall being watches and communicates. The small beings do not respond to the witness as an individual. The tall being does, at least partially. The small beings execute. The tall being directs, and in directing, reveals that it has a perspective, an agenda, that the small beings either do not have or do not express. Whether this behavioral distinction reflects a distinction between species is ultimately a question that cannot be resolved from behavioral evidence alone, but it narrows the range of single-species models that remain viable. If both types are the same species, the developmental stage model is essentially ruled out by the binary size distribution, the The sexual dimorphism model is made less plausible by the complete absence of behavioral patterns that would reflect sexual differentiation. What remains of the single-species model, if we are to preserve it, is the biological caste model, two morphological and cognitive subtypes within a single species, each specialized to the point where they appear and in some important respects function as distinct beings. That is a viable model. It is not the only viable model. And the next part of this documentary will look at the claims made by people who had access to information that, if accurate, goes beyond what can be derived from civilian testimony. The whistleblowers, the intelligence insiders, the alleged government contractors who claim direct knowledge of not just what these beings look like, but what they are and where they come from. Before we go there, it is worth sitting with something that the behavioral analysis has surfaced but not fully named. In every encounter account that includes both types, there is a relationship between the two types that is observed by the human witness. The human is terrified, or in awe, or confused, or all three, and they are watching these two kinds of beings interact. And what they are watching, in case after case, is something that does not look like colleagues at work, or peers in a team, or two members of the same species who happen to have different roles. What it looks like, over and over again, is something much older and stranger. The relationship between a mind that has a purpose and the instruments through which that purpose is carried out. This does not mean Type 1 is not alive, or not in some sense a being with its own existence. It means that the tall gray, in every account where both types are present, is the one with the evident agenda. The small gray serves the agenda. The tall gray holds it, and that asymmetry, the asymmetry of purpose, of agenda, of something that functions like will, is the deepest behavioral distinction in the entire encounter record. Inside the veil, whistleblowers, intelligence insiders, and what they claim to know. There is a category of testimony about the grays that sits apart from civilian encounter accounts. It comes not from people who were taken from their beds or from their cars on lonely roads, but from people who claim to have worked within government, military, or intelligence frameworks that had official knowledge of and interaction with non-human intelligences. This testimony is simultaneously the most compelling and the most problematic in the entire field. It is the most compelling because, if true, it provides direct institutional corroboration of the civilian encounter record and goes beyond it to offer specifics about the biology, origins, and intentions of the beings involved. It is the most problematic because the people delivering it are operating within or adjacent to systems that have demonstrated a clear institutional interest in controlling the information environment around this subject, and because the incentives for both truth-telling and deception are complex and not always transparent. We are going to examine this testimony carefully. We are going to note what is claimed, evaluate it against the civilian record, identify where it corroborates, where it contradicts, and where it introduces genuinely new information. And we are going to be honest about the epistemological problems, rather than either wholesale accepting or wholesale dismissing what these individuals say. The whistleblower testimony, relevant to the single versus double species question, comes from several sources. Some of these sources are well known in the UFO research community and have been extensively discussed. Others are less prominent but potentially more significant for the specific question we are examining. We will work through them in rough chronological order of when their testimony became public. The first major wave of whistleblower testimony about non-human intelligences came from former military personnel connected to the 1947 Roswell incident and its aftermath. Among these, the most relevant to our question are accounts that describe the biological entities recovered from the crash site. The most detailed and most consistently cited of these accounts comes from Lieutenant Cole Philip Corso, who published The Day After Roswell in 1997. Corso claimed to have personally examined the recovered beings in the early 1960s and to have had access to the documentation of the crash recovery. He described the entities as small, approximately 4 feet tall, with large heads and enormous dark eyes, thin limbs, and the familiar gray phenotype. His description aligns precisely with Type 1. He did not describe encountering a taller type at Roswell specifically, but he made references in his book and in subsequent interviews to having been briefed on the existence of multiple types of beings associated with the recovered craft, with the small beings described as the operational personnel and a separate category of beings described as the originators or architects of the program. Corso's testimony is contested. His critics have challenged specific factual claims in his book, and some researchers have questioned the chain of custody he describes for the materials he allegedly handled. But the distinction he draws between operational beings and architect beings maps almost precisely onto the Type 1, Type 2 distinction in the civilian testimony, and he arrived at this distinction through a completely different information pathway, military intelligence briefings, rather than hypnotic regression of civilian witnesses. This parallel convergence, if both sources have any relationship to the same underlying reality, is significant. More directly relevant is the testimony that emerged from alleged participants in programs that claimed ongoing contact with non-human intelligences rather than simply the aftermath of a crash event. The most prominent and the most controversial of these is the testimony associated with the alleged Majestic 12 documents, a set of briefing papers that, if authentic, would indicate the existence of a compartmented government program with detailed knowledge of multiple types of non-human beings. The authenticity of the MJ-12 documents has been debated intensely for decades. Some researchers consider them genuine leaked intelligence documents. Others believe they are forgeries, possibly produced by intelligence agencies as part of a deliberate disinformation campaign. The debate has not been definitively resolved. What the MJ-12 documents assert, and what is relevant to our inquiry, is that the beings associated with crash recoveries represent more than one type of entity. The documents use different terminology than we have been using, but the descriptions map onto the two gray types: small beings, described as the workers or crew of the recovered craft, and taller beings, described as holding what the documents call command authority. This language is precise enough to be interesting. Command authority is a specific term in military and intelligence contexts, and its use to describe the relationship between the two types suggests whoever wrote the documents, whether they were genuine intelligence personnel or sophisticated forgers, had a specific conceptual framework in mind for the hierarchy between the types. The MJ-12 documents also contain what appears to be biological analysis of the recovered entities. The analysis is rudimentary by comparison with what a modern laboratory could produce, but it notes differences between the examined entities consistent with both types existing. The small beings are described as having a cellular structure and organ arrangement that is distinct from the larger beings in specific ways. If this is genuine analysis of actual biological material, it would be the strongest available evidence for the two-species hypothesis. If it is fabricated, the fabrication was done by someone with sophisticated knowledge of both biology and the encounter testimony record. The next major figure in the whistleblower timeline is Bob Lazar, who in 1989 publicly claimed to have worked at a classified facility near Area 51 in Nevada, designated S4, where he alleged he was involved in back-engineering non-human craft. Lazar's testimony is primarily about technology, about propulsion systems and gravity wave generators, but in interviews, he has made claims about the beings associated with the craft that are directly relevant to our question. He described seeing what he said was a briefing document about the beings. According to Lazar, the document described beings from the Zeta Reticuli star system, consistent with what Betty Hill's star map was later interpreted to indicate, and described them as having a shared biology, but with functional differentiation that, based on his description, maps closely onto the Type 1, Type 2 distinction. Critically, Lazar claimed that the document he read described the small beings as workers or laborers, and used language that implied they were not fully autonomous biological entities. The precise language he recalled was something close to describing them as engineered. He was careful to note that this was his interpretation of language he had read in a briefing document, not a direct technical assessment he had conducted himself. But the claim that an official government briefing document described Type 1 beings as engineered, as manufactured rather than naturally evolved, is one of the most significant details in the entire whistleblower literature on this question. It must be weighed against the extensive criticism of Lazar's testimony, His educational credentials have been challenged, with some critics claiming his accounts of attending MIT and Caltech cannot be verified and may be fabricated. His description of the propulsion technology he allegedly back-engineered has been scrutinized by physicists with mixed results, some finding it incoherent, others finding that it shows surprising consistency with legitimate theoretical physics developed after Lazar's initial testimony. The question of whether he saw what he claimed to see or fabricated a convincing account drawing on classified information he accessed through legitimate channels, or was fed a carefully constructed disinformation narrative to be seeded into the public domain cannot be definitively resolved with the evidence currently available. But again, his testimony about the biological distinction between the two types of beings maps closely onto the civilian encounter record, which he claims not to have been familiar with at the time of his initial disclosures. A more recent, and in some ways more carefully documented entry in the whistleblower literature comes from David Grush, the former National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and National Reconnaissance Office official, who in 2023 made sworn testimony before the United States Congress asserting the existence of classified programs involving non-human intelligence and recovered non-human materials. Grush's testimony was historic in that it was delivered under oath in a congressional setting, with the associated legal implications if he was found to be lying. He did not provide physical evidence during his public testimony, citing the classified nature of the specific programs, but he named individuals whom he claimed had corroborated his accounts in classified settings, and he submitted classified testimony to the appropriate oversight bodies separately from his public statements. Grush's specific claims about the biology of the non-human entities are limited in his public statements, but in interviews following his congressional testimony, he has made references to multiple types of entities being associated with the recovered programs. He has explicitly declined to specify details about morphology or type differentiation in public settings, citing classification concerns, but he has confirmed that the programs he describes involve more than a single type of entity and that the relationships between those types are themselves subjects of classified research. This is a carefully worded non-denial of the Type 1, Type 2 distinction, delivered by someone whose institutional credentials and willingness to operate under oath give his testimony more weight than most anonymous sources. The challenge with all of this testimony, even the most credentialed and carefully delivered, is the impossibility of independent verification. The government has consistently denied the existence of programs involving recovered non-human materials, which means any whistleblower claiming knowledge of such programs is automatically operating in a credibility gap that cannot be closed without official disclosure. The catch-22 of UFO whistleblower testimony is structural. The things they are describing, if real, are kept secret precisely to prevent the kind of public scrutiny that would allow their claims to be evaluated. Absence of official confirmation is not disproof. It is exactly what you would expect, whether the claims are true or false. This makes the epistemological situation genuinely difficult rather than simply frustrating. What the whistleblower testimony does, even with all these caveats, is expand the question of single versus double species beyond the civilian encounter record. In the civilian record, the distinction between the two types is observable. People see them, interact with them, describe them, but the civilian record does not give us access to what anyone with institutional knowledge of these beings actually believes about their relationship to each other. The whistleblower testimony, to the extent that it has any relationship to genuine institutional knowledge, suggests that people who have studied these beings in official contexts have arrived at a model that includes multiple types with distinct functions, and that at least some of those people have concluded that the distinction is biological rather than merely social. There is a thread of whistleblower testimony that has received comparatively less attention than the Roswell-era material or the more recent congressional disclosures, but which may be the most specific about the Type 1, Type 2 question. This testimony comes from a series of individuals who claim to have worked in or around classified biological research programs focused on the beings recovered from crash sites. The most detailed accounts come from individuals known in the research community only by pseudonyms, who gave interviews to researchers like Linda Moulton Howe in the 1990s and early 2000s. These individuals claimed direct access to biological analysis of recovered entities, and their accounts are consistent in describing two biologically distinct types. According to this testimony, the biological analysis of recovered entities found that the smaller beings and the larger beings shared certain fundamental biological characteristics, consistent with either a common ancestor or a common design, but differed in specific ways that the analysts considered species-level distinctions rather than intraspecies variation. The differences cited included distinct organ arrangements in the central nervous system, different cellular compositions in specific tissue types, and chromosomal differences that, in the analyst's assessment, were too significant to be consistent with simple variation within a single species. The analyst's conclusion, as described by these witnesses, was that the two types were related but distinct, not siblings in the taxonomic sense of siblings within one species, but more like the difference between two closely related primate species, genuinely different organisms that shared a common evolutionary history. This testimony is the most specific available on the biological question, and it is also the most difficult to evaluate. The pseudonymous witnesses cannot be cross-referenced against verifiable institutional records. Their descriptions of the biological analysis they claim to have seen cannot be independently verified. The consistency of their accounts with each other and with the civilian testimony record is suggestive, but is exactly what you would expect from either genuine independent witnesses to the same facts, or from a coordinated disinformation effort that had studied the civilian record before constructing its cover story. The same epistemological wall that confronts all whistleblower testimony in this field confronts this subset as well. There is one aspect of the whistleblower testimony that is less ambiguous in its significance: the reports of living beings. Multiple whistleblowers claim that not all non-human entities associated with crash retrievals were dead. Some were recovered alive. Some survived for periods ranging from hours to years in government custody. The accounts of interaction with living recovered entities are among the most specific and the most contested in the entire field. The most documented case is EBE-1. The alleged extraterrestrial biological entity recovered from the Roswell crash and said to have survived for approximately 2 years in government custody before dying. The accounts of EBE-1 are fragmentary and inconsistent in some details, but the description of the being is consistently Type 1, small, gray, large-eyed, incapable of or uninterested in verbal communication. There are no credible accounts of a taller being recovered alive and surviving in custody at Roswell, though some accounts suggest a second crash event in 1947 or 1948, the beings from which were described differently, one survivor described in terms consistent with Type 2. If both Type 1 and Type 2 beings have been in government custody, and if biological analysis of both types has been conducted, then the institutional knowledge about the single versus double species question should be much more definitive than anything available in the civilian record. The fact that no official confirmation of either type has been released means that this institutional knowledge, whatever it is, has been successfully contained for nearly 8 decades. That containment itself tells us something. Whatever the government knows about these beings, it has judged that knowledge to be among the most protected secrets in its history. The consistent denial and the consistent classification of any relevant materials suggests either that there is nothing to hide, which contradicts the weight of the whistleblower testimony, or that what there is to hide is considered so consequential that the ordinary cost-benefit calculations of government secrecy do not apply. There is a framework that some researchers have proposed for understanding why the single versus double species question, if it has been officially resolved, would be among the most classified findings. The reasoning goes like this. Confirming that non-human intelligences exist is one level of disclosure. Confirming that there are 2 types of non-human intelligences is a separate level, and confirming that the relationship between those 2 types is one of creation and creation, that Type 1 is an engineered construct of Type 2, carries philosophical and theological implications that dwarf even the basic disclosure of non-human contact. Because if the tall grays engineered the small ones, then we are in the presence of beings who have mastered the engineering of life itself, and that mastery raises a question that the encounter testimony suggests has been asked in both directions. If they can engineer one species, have they engineered others? And is one of those others us? This is the most extreme and most contentious thread in the whistleblower literature. It is not our purpose here to endorse it, but we would be intellectually dishonest if we did not acknowledge that it exists, that it appears in multiple independent sources, and that it is consistent with certain elements of the encounter testimony that we have not yet examined, specifically the communications from tall gray beings that several witnesses report receiving, communications that touch on the relationship between the beings and the human species in ways that go considerably beyond a simple research program. That thread, what the tall grays say about themselves and about us, is the subject of Part 6. Before we get there, we need to examine a category of evidence that has been underused in the single versus double species debate: the physical trace evidence left at encounter locations, and what the distribution and characteristics of that evidence tell us about who was present. Traces in the world, physical evidence and what it implies. Physical trace evidence associated with close encounters occupies an uncomfortable position in the broader investigation of the gray phenomenon. It is too real and too well documented to be ignored. It is too ambiguous and too often compromised to be conclusive. It sits in the permanent middle ground that characterizes almost everything in this field. Genuine enough to sustain serious inquiry, elusive enough to resist definitive interpretation. For the specific question of whether short grays and tall grays are the same species, physical trace evidence offers only indirect testimony. No landing site has ever produced two sets of footprints, one small, one large, that could be measured and compared. No biological material has been recovered and conclusively identified as belonging to either type. But the indirect testimony, assembled carefully, is more informative than it might initially appear. Let us begin with landing trace evidence. When craft associated with gray encounters are reported to have landed or hovered very close to the ground, they sometimes leave physical marks, burned or depressed vegetation, concentric rings of flattened or desiccated grass or crops, sometimes with unusual radioactive signatures or unexplained chemical changes in the affected soil. Soil compaction patterns consistent with a heavy object resting on legs or pads. Sometimes crystalline formations in the soil beneath the landing zone, consistent with localized heating beyond what normal fires produce. This evidence has been extensively cataloged by researchers including Ted Phillips, who maintained one of the most comprehensive databases of physical trace cases in the world, eventually documenting more than 5,000 individual landing trace events globally. The landing trace evidence is relevant to the species question because, in a subset of cases where witnesses were present during a landing event and described the beings they saw emerge from or enter the craft, the being descriptions are available alongside the physical trace data. When these correlations are examined, a pattern emerges. Cases involving only Type 1 beings, small grays working without a taller companion, tend to be associated with shorter events and often with evidence of physical procedures conducted nearby, such as animal tissue sampling or collection of biological or mineral materials. Cases where Type 2 is present, or where witness descriptions are more consistent with Type 2 morphology, tend to be associated with events that have a more extended duration and that involve more complex interaction with the witness. The trace patterns left behind are not reliably different in terms of the physical marks, but the context in which the marks occur varies in ways that align with the behavioral distinction between the types. This is a very indirect inference, and it should not bear more weight than the methodology can support, but it is consistent with a model in which the two types operate in different contexts, with Type 1 being deployable for straightforward collection operations and Type 2 reserved for operations involving communication with or assessment of human subjects. If the deployment contexts differ, the trace patterns they leave will differ only in their associated witness descriptions, not in the physical characteristics of the marks themselves. The trace evidence cannot tell us whether two different biologies were present, only that the behavioral contexts associated with the two types are distinct. The more informative category of physical trace evidence is the implant material, because it potentially gives us direct physical access to something created or implanted by the beings, rather than simply left in the environment by the passage of their craft. The history of implant research is long, deeply contentious, and full of the methodological problems that plague the field generally. But at its best, in the work of Roger Leir and the analyses conducted by legitimate laboratories, it represents a genuine attempt to apply scientific rigor to the physical claims of encounter witnesses. Lear's surgical implant removals produced objects that varied considerably in their properties. Some were straightforwardly identified as mundane foreign bodies with no anomalous characteristics. These were consistent with people who had ordinary injuries, particularly in the extremities, who had convinced themselves under hypnotic regression or otherwise that these were alien implants. But a subset of the objects Leir removed had properties that the laboratories analyzing them were unable to explain in terms of terrestrial manufacture. These included materials with anomalous isotopic ratios, objects with carbon nanostructures that were not achievable with then available manufacturing technology, and in several cases, objects coated in a biological membrane made of a protein composite that was preventing normal foreign body immune response, which is why the objects had gone undetected for years and produced no inflammation. The anomalous objects cluster into two categories in terms of their physical characteristics. One category consists of small, irregularly shaped metallic or composite objects, most commonly recovered from the nasal cavity, the back of the hand, the shin, or the foot. These are physically consistent with tracking or monitoring devices. They are small, passive, and their position in the body is not obviously consistent with any known medical function. The second category consists of objects that are more structurally complex. Objects with internal structures visible under imaging, sometimes described as having geometric regularity that suggests deliberate manufacture. These objects are less common and are found in different body locations, sometimes in muscle tissue rather than subcutaneous locations, and sometimes with nerve tissue that appears to have grown around them, integrating the object with the nervous system. If we accept the hypothesis that both categories of objects were placed by non-human beings, which is a hypothesis, not an established fact, then the two categories might represent the work of two different types of beings. The simple tracking objects would be consistent with Type 1's operational function, straightforward monitoring, placed efficiently, designed to remain undetected. The more complex nerve-integrated objects would be consistent with a more sophisticated purpose, one involving integration with the nervous system that would allow more complex forms of communication or information retrieval. If Type 2 is the communicator and the interface with human consciousness is one of its tools, then a device that integrates with nerve tissue and potentially interfaces with the nervous system would be a Type 2 implant, not a Type 1 one. This is inference built on hypothesis, and it needs to be held lightly. But the two-category distribution of the anomalous implant materials is a real pattern in the data, and the alignment of that pattern with the behavioral distinction between the two types is not something that was predicted in advance and then confirmed. It is a retrospective observation that needs to be tested against more data. If future implant recoveries and analysis continue to find two distinct categories of anomalous objects with different structural characteristics and different body placements, that would be meaningful evidence for two different manufacturing sources and, by extension, for two different types of beings. Crop formations represent another category of physical trace evidence that some researchers have connected to gray encounters. The relationship between crop formations and gray beings is not straightforward. Most serious crop circle researchers do not specifically connect the formations to gray contact, and the majority of crop formations have been credibly attributed to human hoaxers. But a subset of cases involves formations that appear to have been produced with greater speed and precision than human teams could achieve, with plant stems bent rather than broken in ways that require heating at the node, and with anomalous changes in the soil chemistry and radiation levels within the formation. These cases, a small minority of the total, are harder to explain. The relevance to the species question is again indirect. Some witnesses who have been present at or near genuine formation events describe seeing lights and craft, and in a smaller number of cases describe seeing beings in the vicinity. The being descriptions in these cases tend toward type 2 rather than type 1, taller figures, sometimes described as having an almost luminous quality, more rarely described than the short beings that characterize bedroom abductions. If the formation of the more complex, genuinely anomalous crop patterns is an activity associated specifically with the taller type, this would be consistent with a model in which type 2 is engaged in communication, including communication directed at humanity generally through symbols left in the landscape, while type 1 is engaged in the more direct physical operations. This is speculative in the extreme, but it is a pattern worth noting because it would fit coherently into the larger behavioral model. Animal mutilation events represent perhaps the most disturbing category of physical trace evidence connected to the UFO and gray phenomenon. Cattle mutilations, and to a lesser extent, mutilations of other livestock and wild animals, have been documented across North and South America, Europe, and Australia over more than 50 years. The characteristics of these mutilations are well established. Precise, clean removal of specific organs and tissue with no apparent blood loss, no footprints or physical evidence of the presence of human or known animal agents, cuts made with a precision that initially suggested surgical instruments, but that later analysis sometimes attributed to extremely high heat or laser-like tools that simultaneously cut and cauterized tissue. These events are unexplained by conventional means, and their distribution and characteristics have led many researchers to connect them to the same intelligences responsible for close encounters with gray beings. The question for our purposes is whether animal mutilations show any behavioral signature consistent with the presence of type 1, type 2, or both. The field evidence, such as it is, because the chain of custody and documentation quality varies enormously between cases, does not include witness accounts of gray beings at most mutilation sites. A small number of cases have witnesses who describe seeing lights and craft in the vicinity of mutilation events, but specific being descriptions are rare. What is available is the nature of the procedure itself. The precision and selectivity of the tissue removal is consistent with a research operation, collection of specific biological samples for analysis. This is exactly the kind of operation the behavioral record suggests type 1 conducts. It is collection work, physical and efficient, and without any apparent interest in the experience of the animal. If type 1 is the tissue collector, the distribution of mutilation events across decades and continents is consistent with a long-running systematic biological research program. The specific selection of organs and tissues removed, consistently the reproductive organs, the rectum, the tongue, the eyes, sometimes the ears and lips, and invariably the blood, points toward a research interest in biological systems related to reproduction, sensory function, and genetic material. The same biological interests appear in abduction accounts involving human subjects. This convergence between the tissue samples collected from animals and the procedures conducted on human abductees suggests the same research program conducted by the same operational intelligence across multiple species simultaneously. What this tells us about type 1 and type 2 is that type 1 appears to operate independently for straightforward collection tasks. The mutilation events show no evidence of the more complex interaction with subjects that characterizes type 2's involvement. There is no communication, no apparent attempt to minimize distress, no observable hierarchy of command visible in the traces left behind, just the work done precisely and then departure. If type 2 is only present when communication with human subjects is required, then animal operations would involve only type 1, and the physical evidence of those operations would reflect only type 1's operational signature: clean, efficient, precise, and utterly indifferent to the nature of the being it is working with. Some researchers have used this analysis to argue for the biological robot hypothesis. Type 1 as a programmed collection organism that operates across a wide range of targets without any moral or social filter, because it has neither the capacity for nor the need for such a filter. The same beings that take tissue samples from cattle move humans from their beds. The the same clinical efficiency is applied to both. If type 1 had any inner life that registered the difference between a terrified steer and a terrified human, you would expect some difference in the procedures, some accommodation for the cognitive complexity of the human subject. There is none. The procedures follow the same logic, regardless of the subject's capacity for suffering or communication. This is either the behavior of a being that genuinely cannot register these differences, or the behavior of a being that has been designed not to register them. Physical evidence does not ultimately resolve the species question. It can only constrain the space of possible answers. What it constrains toward is a model in which two types of beings are involved in the encounter phenomenon, with different operational signatures, different behavioral profiles, and different relationships to the human subjects of their attention. Whether those two types are biologically distinct species or biologically differentiated subtypes of the same species, the physical evidence cannot tell us, but it is consistent with either version of the two-type model and inconsistent with models that posit only a single uniform entity. There is one final category of physical evidence that deserves examination before we move to the communication content: the bodies of the witnesses themselves. Close encounter witnesses exhibit, at rates significantly above control populations, a specific constellation of physical effects following their experiences. These include localized skin markings, burns, punctures, scoop-shaped tissue removal, in patterns inconsistent with self-infliction or with known medical conditions. They include unexplained implants, as discussed. They include lasting biological changes, including alterations in brainwave activity, electromagnetic sensitivity, and in some cases anomalous changes in blood chemistry or immune function. And they include, in a subset of cases, pregnancy events that cannot be explained by normal reproduction. Unexpected pregnancies that appear and then disappear without miscarriage in women who report encounters, and in some cases, in women whose subsequent medical examination shows no evidence of having been pregnant. These physical effects are the bodily traces of whatever happened to these witnesses. They are, in many cases, the only physical evidence that the witness themselves can point to as proof that something real occurred, and their distribution within the witness population is not random relative to the type of encounter described. Witnesses who describe encounters predominantly involving type 1, the physical work phase of encounters, without substantial involvement of type 2, tend to show primarily the physical tissue effects, the skin marks, the implants, the physical sampling evidence. Witnesses who describe encounters involving significant interaction with type 2, particularly those who describe extended communication with the taller beings, show a different profile of effects, weighted more toward the neurological and electromagnetic changes. The body is keeping score, and it is keeping a different score depending on which type of being was primarily involved. This differential is the most tantalizing piece of physical evidence available, and it is also the least studied. No systematic study has been conducted of whether the physical after effects of gray encounters correlate with the specific types described by witnesses. Such a study would require a large, carefully documented case pool with both detailed witness testimony and standardized medical examination protocols. The closest thing to this that has been attempted was Jacobs's research program at Temple University, but its focus was primarily on the testimony rather than the systematic documentation of physical effects. If a systematic study of this kind were conducted and found the differential that the existing evidence suggests, if witnesses reporting primarily type 1 encounters showed different physical profiles from witnesses reporting extensive type 2 encounters, that would be among the most significant empirical findings in the history of UFO research, because it would mean that the distinction between the two types is producing measurable, different physical effects in human witnesses. Different effects produced by different entities. That is precisely what the two-species hypothesis predicts. What they say, communications from the tall grays, and what they mean. Of all the evidence bearing on the question of whether the short and tall grays are the same species, the most philosophically significant and the most difficult to evaluate is the content of what the tall grays communicate to human witnesses. This communication record is extensive, spanning decades of documented encounters, involving witnesses from every background and culture, and displaying a thematic consistency that is either evidence of a genuine intelligence with a real message or evidence of a shared cultural myth generating consistent internal content. Evaluating which of these explanations is more likely is one of the central challenges in understanding the phenomenon. But for our purposes, the communication content is important because of what it says about the relationship between the communicator, the tall gray, and the workers, the short ones. What the tall grays say about the short ones, directly or indirectly, is one of the most revealing data sets in the entire encounter record. Before examining the content, a methodological note is essential. The communications from tall gray beings reported by witnesses come through at least 4 distinct channels, each with its own reliability problems. The first is direct verbal speech during a conscious encounter, where the witness hears or perceives language during the event itself and retains conscious memory of it. The second is telepathic impression during a conscious encounter, where no audible language is involved, but the witness receives a clear informational content that they can report after the fact. The third is material recovered under hypnotic regression, where communication that the witness did not consciously retain is accessed through the regression process, with all the reliability concerns that implies. The fourth is what some witnesses describe as ongoing communication outside of the formal encounter context. Messages or impressions received days or weeks after an encounter, often in a state somewhere between waking and sleep. These 4 channels are not equally reliable, and the communication content retrieved through them is not uniformly consistent. The hypnotically recovered material, as discussed, carries the highest contamination risk. The conscious recall material is more robust, but also less common. The ongoing post-encounter communication is the most personal and the most difficult to evaluate independently. With those caveats registered, let us look at what the tall grays actually communicate. The most universal element of tall gray communication is an assertion of purpose. Almost every witness who describes substantive communication from a Type 2 being describes receiving an impression, rarely articulated in detail, but always present, that what is happening is intentional, planned, and part of a larger project. The small beings do not communicate this. They perform procedures that are clearly intentional and clearly organized, but they do not offer any context for what they are doing. The tall gray provides the context, and the context is always, at its core, that this is part of something. The witness is part of something. The encounter is part of something. The details of what that something is vary considerably between accounts, but the fundamental assertion that there is purpose here and that the witness is included in that purpose is consistent. What is the nature of the purpose described? The most common framing involves the long-term relationship between the beings and the human species. Witnesses are told, in various ways and with various levels of specificity, that this relationship is old, much older than the modern era of close encounters, that it has been continuous across generations, involving not just the current witness, but their ancestors, and will extend to their descendants, that the beings have what they describe as an investment in humanity, a stake in what human beings are and what they become. That is more than scientific curiosity. The hybridization program is the most specific content of this communication. In cases where the tall gray speaks directly about what is being done to the witness and why, the most common explanation offered is a program of biological exchange or hybridization, the creation of beings that combine human and gray characteristics. The stated reasons for this program vary and are sometimes contradictory between accounts. The most common explanation offered is that the gray species faces a biological crisis, that they have reached a developmental endpoint where their own genome is no longer capable of the kind of biological flexibility that allows adaptation and change. Human genetics, which carries enormous genetic diversity and a robust capacity for biological variation, is described as providing something the grays need but lack. The hybridization program is described as an attempt to introduce this biological flexibility into a gray genome that has become too fixed. This explanation has an interesting internal logic. A species that has been evolving primarily through cognitive rather than biological change for millions of years might well reach a point where its genome is highly optimized but also highly constrained. Natural selection operates by differentiating between variants, and if a species reaches a point where its cognitive technology buffers it completely from environmental selection pressures, the genome may stop changing in functionally meaningful ways. It would not deteriorate quickly. Genetic maintenance mechanisms would prevent wholesale corruption, but it might lose the plasticity that allows it to respond to new challenges. If this were the situation, access to a much younger species dynamic, diverse genome would be genuinely useful. The alternative explanation sometimes offered by witnesses is less comfortable. In some accounts, the tall gray does not describe a biological rescue program, but rather something more like a program of gradual replacement. The hybrids being produced are described not as a supplement to the gray genome, but as a successor, beings that will eventually replace both human beings and the current gray forms with a new type of entity that carries characteristics of both. Some witnesses describe receiving this information with something approaching peace, as though the tall gray has managed their emotional response to it. Others describe receiving it with horror. The emotional management, the way the tall gray frames information that could be terrifying in terms that reduce the terror without actually changing the content, is itself one of the most frequently noted features of the communication. For the species question, the communication content about the hybridization program is significant in a specific way. When witnesses describe being told about the program by the tall gray, they report that the small beings are described implicitly or explicitly as participants in the program rather than its planners. The tall gray appears to occupy the position of program architect, the being that has the vision, that knows the destination, that understands why the program exists. The small beings execute the program. They are its workforce. And in accounts where the tall gray speaks about the small beings at all, which is not common, but it happens, the language used does not suggest species peer solidarity. It suggests something else. The most striking example of this appears in the testimony of a witness known in the literature as Jason Howard, documented by researcher Dr. John Mack in his book, Passport to the Cosmos. Howard, a university professor who sought regression therapy for experiences he had been having since childhood, described in one session an encounter in which a tall gray spoke to him about what the small beings were. The language in Mack's transcript is careful because Howard himself was careful, struggling to convey something he found philosophically disorienting. The tall being had communicated to him, Howard said, something along the lines of, "The workers are not what you think they are. They are not like us. They were made." This distinction between beings that exist in a natural state and beings that were made was accompanied in Howard's account by an emotional tone in the communication that he described as something between pride and detachment, not affection for the made things, something more like a craftsman's relationship to a tool, appreciation for its function, indifference to its inner life. Howard's account is a single case, but it is consistent with a thread that runs through dozens of other accounts in which witnesses receive any information about the relationship between the two types. The tall gray does not describe the small gray as a colleague. It does not describe it as a family member. It does not describe it as another version of itself at a younger age. In the accounts where this relationship is addressed, the language, even when filtered through translation, and the imprecision of telepathic communication recovered in regression, consistently places the two types in a relationship of creator and created, or at minimum of authority and subject, that goes beyond the social hierarchy of a single species caste system. There is another dimension of the tall gray communications that bears on the species question, and it is perhaps the most philosophically profound, what the tall grays say about themselves. The communications that witnesses receive from Type 2, beings about the nature and origin of those beings, are fragmentary, inconsistent in their specifics, and deeply colored by the epistemological problems already discussed. But certain themes recur with enough consistency to be noted. The tall grays, in the accounts where they address their own nature, describe themselves as very old. Not old in the sense of individual age, but old in the sense of civilizational age. They have been what they are for a very long time by human scales. They describe a history that predates human civilization by what, when specifics are given, amounts to millions of years. They describe having passed through a phase of existence that sounds, filtered through human perception and recall, something like what humanity is currently experiencing, a phase of rapid technological development, biological vulnerability, and the existential risks that accompany a species that has developed weapons capable of self-destruction before it has developed the wisdom to reliably choose not to use them. They imply in various ways that they came through that phase, and that part of their interest in humanity is the knowledge of what that passage requires. They do not describe the small beings as having this history. In accounts where witnesses receive anything about the history of the beings they are encountering, the history provided is always given in a way that applies to the tall type. The small ones have no apparent history being communicated. They did not come from somewhere. They are here, they do the work, and the tall one's narrative of civilizational history does not include them as actors. They were not part of the journey. They are part of the present operational structure. This is a powerful piece of indirect evidence for the manufactured hypothesis. A species narrating its own history would include all members of that species in the narrative. You do not tell the story of your civilization and exclude half your population, unless those members are not, in the relevant historical sense, your population at all. If the small greys were manufactured at some point in the tall greys' long history, created as a labor force after the tall greys' civilizational development had reached a point where this was possible, then they would indeed be absent from the pre-creation history. They would not have ancestors. They would not have an origin story within the tall gray civilizational narrative because they did not exist when that narrative was forming. There is a deeply strange consistency across many of these communications that becomes visible only when you look at a large number of cases together. Witnesses from different countries, in different decades, reporting encounters with beings that communicate in ways that are by definition not in any human language, consistently report receiving the same set of conceptual distinctions. The distinction between made and born. The distinction between those who have a history and those who do not. The distinction between beings with an agenda and beings that serve an agenda. These distinctions are never articulated in those terms during the encounters. They emerge in the way the communication is structured, in what is omitted as much as what is included, in the emotional tone that accompanies specific topics. But they converge. They converge on a picture of two fundamentally different kinds of beings who share an operational environment and a project, with one of them having created or at least profoundly shaped the other. What should we make of this communication record? The skeptic's position is clear. This is mythology. Human beings have always generated stories about two categories of supernatural beings, those with power and those who serve power, and the alien encounter narrative simply maps current cultural anxieties onto this archetypal structure. The fact that multiple witnesses independently produce the same story is not evidence that the story is true. It is evidence that the underlying psychological structure generating the story is universal. The tall director and the short worker are not separate species. They are the hero and the helper, the god and the angel, the master and the slave in extraterrestrial costume. This is a serious argument. The history of religion, mythology, and anthropology provides ample evidence that human beings are predisposed to construct hierarchical narratives about supernatural beings, and that these narratives tend to cluster around certain structural relationships. The creator and the created, the knower and the tool. These are structures deep in human mythological thinking, and their appearance in alien encounter narratives does not require a non-human source. The counter-argument is equally serious. The mythological explanation works for the narrative content. The story's witnesses tell about what the being said. It does not work as well for the physical descriptions and behavioral patterns, which do not follow mythological logic. Myths do not produce consistent biometric details about specific physical differences in eye structure between two types of beings. Myths do not produce consistent reports of three-fingered versus differently fingered beings, or of skin temperature differences, or of the specific way the tall gray's eyes appear to have slightly more visible depth than the short gray's. Myths produce symbols. The encounter record produces something that reads more like observational reports, imprecise and variable in the way all human observational reports are imprecise and variable, but not organized around mythological logic. It is organized around the logic of a real phenomenon being imperfectly perceived and imperfectly recalled by fallible human observers. The communication content, specifically the content about the relationship between the two types, lives on the boundary between these explanations. It is the most mythologically structured element of the encounter record, the one most susceptible to the critique that human witnesses are imposing narrative structure on experience that defies it. But even if we allow for significant narrative imposition by witnesses, the sheer consistency of the specific imposition, not just hierarchy, but the specific creator and created framing, is a data point that the pure mythological explanation has to account for. Why this specific mythological structure and not others? Why not the battle between equals? Why not the cooperative partnership of different but mutually respectful intelligences? Why consistently the asymmetry of maker and made? The answer from the psychological perspective would be that the maker and made framing is the most cognitively available frame for understanding a relationship in which one party is evidently in charge and the other is evidently executing orders. But that frame is widely available. People could also reach for the employer-employee frame, or the parent-child frame, or the officer-enlisted frame, all of which are equally familiar and equally consistent with the hierarchical behavioral pattern. The fact that multiple witnesses, without apparent coordination, reach for specifically the creation frame, the made thing frame, rather than these other available alternatives, is at minimum curious. We cannot resolve this. The honest answer is that the communication content from tall gray beings is the most philosophically significant and the least epistemologically tractable evidence available. It cannot be validated or invalidated from outside the experience. It comes filtered through all the problems of hypnotic regression and the unreliability of recalled information from altered states. And yet it points, consistently, in the direction of a specific answer to the species question, not the same species in different roles, but two different categories of being in a relationship that is older, stranger, and more asymmetrical than any social hierarchy within a single species could be. The world in gray, global patterns, cross-cultural encounters, and what geography tells us. One of the most powerful arguments against the cultural contamination hypothesis, the claim that encounter witnesses are simply producing imagery absorbed from science fiction, from television documentaries, from the cultural saturation of the gray as a popular icon, is the global distribution of the encounter record. The gray alien, as a specific cultural image, is primarily a product of North American UFO culture, disseminated globally through American entertainment media. If cultural contamination were the principal mechanism generating encounter reports, you would expect the gray phenotype to appear predominantly in culturally accessible areas and to decline or disappear in populations with limited access to American popular culture. The data does not show this. The gray phenotype and the type 1, type 2 behavioral distinction appears in encounter accounts from populations that have minimal access to North American cultural products, in time periods that predate the globalization of American entertainment, and in cultural contexts that have their own indigenous frameworks for understanding non-human encounters that are completely different from the science fiction alien template. This is a critical finding for the species question because it means the two-type model is not an artifact of a specific cultural tradition. It appears cross-culturally, which means either it reflects something in the universal structure of the human imagination, something deep enough to appear before cultural exposure could explain it, or it reflects repeated encounters with the same objective phenomenon by humans in different cultural contexts who describe what they see without reference to each other. Let us examine the geographic distribution in detail. South America has produced some of the most compelling evidence for the cross-cultural reality of the two-type model. Brazilian encounter cases, documented extensively by researchers including Dr. Olavo Fontes in the 1950s and 1960s, and continued by a generation of Brazilian researchers who built on his work, describe beings that map clearly onto both type 1 and type 2, often with a specificity of detail that exceeds the typical North American abduction account. The Brazilian encounter literature is particularly rich in cases involving what appears to be coordinated interaction between beings of different sizes, with the smaller beings conducting operations and a taller, more individualized being present in a supervisory capacity. One of the most extensively documented Brazilian cases is the Varginha incident of January 1996. in which multiple witnesses in the town of Virginia described encountering beings that had been injured or incapacitated, apparently following some kind of event related to a craft. The beings described in Virginia had physical characteristics somewhat different from the classic gray, a more brownish coloration, what witnesses described as a reddish internal structure visible through thin skin, but the size and morphological profile was consistent with type 1. Importantly, some witnesses and some of the military personnel who allegedly recovered or interacted with the beings described a second type, taller, with slightly different features, present in circumstances suggesting authority over the disposition of the smaller ones. The Virginia case is extensively contested, with significant disagreement about specific details and the degree of military involvement, but the two-type distinction in the witness accounts is consistent with the broader pattern. The abduction literature from South America more broadly, particularly from Argentina, Chile, and Peru, shows the same hierarchical two-type structure seen in North American cases. These accounts were gathered primarily by researchers working within local cultural frameworks, without systematic reference to the North American abduction literature, and in many cases before the North American literature was widely available in Spanish translation. The specificity of the physical descriptions, the height differential, the behavioral distinction between workers and communicator, appears in these accounts in terms consistent with independent observation rather than borrowed template. The African encounter record is less well documented than the North American or South American material, primarily because institutional research infrastructure for UFO investigation is limited across most of the continent, and because the cultural framework for interpreting these experiences varies enormously between African communities. But what documentation exists is striking. The aerial school incident of September 1994 in Zimbabwe involved more than 60 school children who reported seeing a craft land in a field near their school and who described beings emerging from or around the craft. The children's accounts, documented in video interviews conducted by researcher Cynthia Hind and later by Harvard psychologist John Mack, are notable for their consistency and for the specificity of the being descriptions. The aerial school children described beings that, in most accounts, were small enough that the children, most of whom were between 6 and 12 years old, found them only slightly smaller than adults. Several of the children's drawings, made immediately after the event, show the classic gray morphology: large head, large eyes, thin body. What is particularly relevant for our inquiry is that a small number of the children's accounts include descriptions of a being that the other children had not mentioned. A taller figure, less directly active, described by the children as standing back while the smaller ones came toward the students. 2 or 3 of the children, in their individual accounts, described this figure as looking at them in a way that was different from the way the smaller ones looked at them, as truly seeing them in a way the children found both frightening and somehow important. These children were Zimbabwean school children in 1994. Their access to North American UFO culture was virtually non-existent. They had no shared template for what an alien encounter was supposed to look like, and within their accounts, organically and without cross-contamination between individual interviews, the two-type distinction emerged: the smaller, more numerous workers and the taller, more individualized presence. Not identical to the North American template in every detail, there are cultural differences in how the experiences are framed and what details the children choose to emphasize, but consistent with the underlying structural distinction that the North American record documents so extensively. The European encounter record adds another layer of cross-cultural evidence. Close encounter cases from France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and the United Kingdom include numerous accounts of gray beings and reflect the same hierarchical two-type pattern, often in cases that predate or are roughly contemporary with the emergence of the gray as a widely known cultural image. The French researcher Jacques Vallée, one of the most rigorous and critical minds to engage seriously with the encounter phenomenon, documented a French case from the 1950s in which a witness described 2 types of beings of different sizes in terms that, with different vocabulary, described what we are calling Type 1 and Type 2. Valley's interpretation of these cases was not that witnesses were seeing literal aliens, but that they were encountering something real, strange, and not adequately explained by either the extraterrestrial hypothesis or the psychological fabrication hypothesis. His documentation, however, preserves the two-type descriptions he received regardless of his interpretive framework, and those descriptions are consistent with the global pattern. The Russian and Eastern European encounter literature, partially accessible through translations of Soviet-era research that was conducted with military seriousness rather than civilian enthusiasm, also reflects the two-type pattern. Several of the most thoroughly documented Soviet-era cases, including encounters investigated by the Soviet Academy of Sciences in response to a wave of reports in the 1970s and 1980s, include descriptions of small gray beings performing operations, accompanied by a taller, more individualized presence. The Soviet investigators, coming from a materialist scientific framework and without the American cultural context of science fiction aliens, were more likely to reach for framework of intelligence gathering operations or psychological operations than for extraterrestrial contact. But their documentation of the witness accounts preserved the physical descriptions, and those physical descriptions align with what witnesses worldwide were reporting independently. The Asian encounter record, and particularly the Japanese and Chinese documentation of close encounters with non-human beings, represents the clearest test case for the hypothesis that the two-type pattern is genuinely cross-cultural rather than culturally contaminated. Japan has its own rich tradition of encounters with non-human intelligences in folklore, the Tengu, the Kappa, various supernatural beings that inhabit the margins of the human world. China has similar traditions. These traditions are fundamentally different from the gray alien template, and their existence should provide alternative frameworks into which encounter experiences are mapped when they occur in Japanese or Chinese cultural contexts. But when documented alien encounter reports from Japan and China are examined, the beings described do not primarily map onto indigenous supernatural templates. They map onto the gray phenotype. This is itself evidence for something. If cultural context were the primary driver of encounter content, Japanese witnesses should be describing something closer to Tengu than to grays. Chinese witnesses should have their own cultural framework absorbing the encounter experience into indigenous categories. They do not, or rather, when they do, it is the exception rather than the rule. The majority of documented encounter reports from Japan and China describe beings that are recognizably consistent with the global gray template, including the two-type hierarchical structure. This cross-cultural convergence on a specific and unusual set of physical characteristics and behavioral patterns is one of the strongest arguments available that the encounter phenomenon has an objective component that transcends cultural context. The implications for the species question are this. The two-type model is not a North American cultural artifact. It is a global phenomenon documented across cultures with minimal access to each other's encounter literature, appearing in descriptions gathered before the cultural contamination could have occurred and consistent in its core structural features, the small operational beings and the taller communicating presence, across languages, cultural frameworks, and historical periods. This global consistency dramatically strengthens the case for the two-type model having a basis in objective reality, whatever that reality turns out to be. And if the two types are objectively real, the question of their biological relationship, same species or different species, is not a cultural question or a mythological question. It is a scientific one, even if current science lacks the tools to answer it definitively. There are some interesting regional variations in how the two types are described globally that are worth examining because they potentially carry information about the objective properties of the beings. In South American accounts, witnesses more frequently describe the tall beings as having a slightly different skin coloration from the small ones more uniformly gray, the tall ones sometimes described as having a faintly greenish or slightly brownish tinge. This detail, appearing in South American accounts more consistently than in North American ones, is either a culturally specific addition or a real characteristic of the tall type that North American witnesses are more likely to normalize into the standard gray template. template. If it is real, it would be consistent with a biological difference in the pigmentation or biochemistry of the skin, which would support the two-species hypothesis. In Asian accounts, the tall beings are more frequently described as having more pronounced features, not just slightly more defined, as in the North American accounts, but described as having features that are almost recognizably individual, almost recognizably person-like. This could reflect a cultural tendency to anthropomorphize authority figures in East Asian contexts, which would be a cultural imposition, or it could reflect a real characteristic of the Type 2 beings, that they have more individual physical variation than Type 1, that Asian witnesses are more attuned to registering and reporting. In African accounts, particularly from sub-Saharan Africa, there is a striking pattern in the descriptions of the being's eyes. African witnesses more frequently describe the eyes of the tall being as having visible light within them, not a reflection of external light, but what witnesses describe as an internal luminescence, as though the eyes generate a faint glow. This detail is present but less common in North American accounts, and rarer still in European accounts. It may reflect the fact that African witnesses, encountering these beings in conditions of rural darkness without the ambient light of urban or suburban environments, are able to perceive a luminescent quality that is lost in the more well-lit conditions typical of North American encounters. Or it may be a cultural elaboration, a supernatural quality that African cosmologies are more likely to attribute to powerful non-human beings. Or it may be a real physical property of the tall gray's eye structure that is genuinely visible only in conditions of sufficient darkness. The regional variations, taken together, suggest something important. The core two-type pattern is globally consistent, but the peripheral details vary in ways that have some relationship to cultural context, perceptual conditions, and individual witness variation. This is exactly what you would expect from a real phenomenon being observed by different people under different conditions with different cultural interpretive frameworks. Pure fabrication would produce either perfect consistency, because fabricators would have access to a shared template, or random variation without the culturally patterned peripheral variations observed. The pattern of globally consistent core features with culturally patterned peripheral variation is the signature of a real object being imperfectly perceived and culturally interpreted by different observers. The global evidence also provides some bearing on the question of frequency. How often does each type appear, and does the relative frequency tell us anything about their relationship? Across the global encounter record, Type 1 substantially outnumbers Type 2 in terms of frequency of appearance in encounter accounts. Rough estimates suggest that Type 2 appears in somewhere between 1/5 and 1/3 of documented close encounter accounts, while Type 1 appears in virtually all of them. This asymmetry is consistent with a model in which Type 1 is deployed in large numbers for operational purposes, while Type 2 is present selectively for encounters where communication with or assessment of a specific human subject is the objective. It is also consistent with a biological population model in which Type 2 is less numerous than Type 1 for reasons of biology or social structure. But the frequency asymmetry also raises an important question for the two-species model. If Type 1 and Type 2 are separate species, what determines when Type 2 is present and when it is not? In a single-species caste model, the answer is simple. Type 2 is the leadership, present when leadership is required. In a two-species model, the answer requires a more complex framework. Either the two species have a formal relationship that governs when Type 2 deploys alongside Type 1 operations, or Type 2 is present at specific categories of encounter by its own independent choice, or Type 2's encounters with human witnesses are not always directly related to the Type 1 operations occurring in the same context. The third possibility, that Type 2 encounters are sometimes independent of Type 1 operations, is suggested by a small but consistent subset of encounter accounts in which witnesses describe contact with what appears to be a tall gray in circumstances that do not include any physical examination or any presence of small beings. These encounters tend to be more communication-focused, less physically intrusive, and more philosophical in their content. They read less like abduction scenarios and more like something closer to a visitation, a contact event whose purpose is informational rather than biological. If this subset is real, it suggests that Type 2 has its own agenda for human contact that is not simply supervisory oversight of Type 1 operations. It has things it wants to communicate, independent of whatever the small ones are doing, and it pursues those communications when conditions are right. This independent agenda, if real, would be significant for the species question because it would place Type 2 not just above Type 1 in a hierarchy, but in a genuinely different category of activity. Two species sharing an operational environment but pursuing different objectives would behave exactly this way. The operational species doing its work, the other pursuing its own purposes, occasionally intersecting. A caste within a single species, by contrast, would be expected to have a unified purpose, even if divided by function. The hybrid question. What the breeding program tells us about biology and intent. If there is one aspect of the gray encounter phenomenon that carries more weight for the single versus double species question than any other, it is the hybridization program. Not because the program's existence is proven, it is not, and the evidence for it rests primarily on witness testimony with all the problems that entails, but because if the program exists as a biological reality, then its nature and mechanics contain definitive information about the biological relationship between the beings conducting it and the humans it involves. And the details reported by witnesses about this program consistently across decades and cultures raise questions about the biological relationship between the two gray types that go directly to the heart of our inquiry. The hybridization program, as described in the abduction literature, involves the systematic collection of human genetic material, eggs, sperm, tissue, and the use of that material in combination with gray genetic material to produce hybrid offspring. These hybrids are described by witnesses as being gestated sometimes in human women, witnesses who become pregnant as a result of their encounters, and sometimes in what appear to be artificial gestation systems aboard craft, described variously as tanks of liquid, incubation chambers, or biological environments whose exact nature the witness cannot determine. The hybrid offspring produced by this program are described in increasing detail over the decades of the encounter record, from vague early descriptions to the quite specific accounts of witnesses in the 1990s and 2000s who describe encounters with partially or fully developed hybrid beings that show characteristics of both human and gray biology. The physical descriptions of the hybrids are internally consistent in a way that is biologically informative. The early-stage hybrids, described as being presented to abductees in what appears to be a request for the witness to interact with and nurture them, are typically described as small, thin, pale, with large heads and large eyes, but with enough human characteristics, a more rounded face, fuller lips, fingers with visible articulation, to be clearly different from pure gray beings. Some witnesses describe these early-stage hybrids as appearing sick or frail, as though the biological combination has not fully succeeded. Later-stage hybrids, described in accounts from witnesses who report multiple encounters over years, are described as more viable, more robust, increasingly difficult to distinguish from unusual-looking humans. Some witnesses describe hybrids that they initially thought were simply unusual-looking people before details emerged that suggested otherwise. The biological logic of this progression, from fragile early hybrids to more viable later ones, is consistent with what we know about the biology of interspecies hybridization. When two genetically different populations attempt to hybridize, the first generation typically shows the greatest incompatibility. Selection over multiple generations of a breeding program, continuously selecting the most viable combinations, would produce increasingly stable hybrids with better developmental outcomes. If the hybridization program described in the encounter literature is real, the progression from failing early hybrids to more viable later ones suggests a genuine biological process unfolding over time, not a static image produced by cultural imagination. Now, what does this tell us about the species question? The most direct implication concerns which type of gray is biologically engaged in the hybridization program. The physical procedures involved in the hybridization program, the collection of reproductive material, the examination and manipulation of the human reproductive system, the presentation of hybrid offspring for witness interaction, are conducted by Type 1, always. In every account, it is the small grays who perform these procedures. The tall gray is present in some, but not all cases involving reproductive procedures, and when it is present, its role is observational and communicative, not hands-on. It is Type 1 that is genetically engaged with human biology. Type 2 watches and explains. This has two possible interpretations. In the single-species model, it is simply a division of labor. The biological workers do the biological work. The communicators communicate. In the two-species model, it might mean something considerably more significant, that it is Type 1's biology that is being combined with human biology, and Type 2's role is to manage and communicate about a program that involves the other species. If Type 1 is the manufactured species, the designed organism, then hybridizing it with human genetics would be a program of modifying the manufactured being, introducing human biological flexibility into the engineered substrate. Type 2 would be the architect of this modification program, present to assess and direct it, but not personally biologically engaged because Type 2 is not the entity being modified. Or in a completely different framing of the two-species model, if Type 2 is the senior species and Type 1 is a separate junior species, perhaps the hybridization is specifically a Type 1 project. Type 2 may be present in an advisory or supervisory capacity in a program that is fundamentally about Type 1's biological future, not Type 2's. This model would mean that it is the short grays, not the tall ones, that face the biological crisis requiring hybridization, and that the tall grays are sufficiently biologically different or sufficiently long past this particular crisis, that they are not participants in the biological program, but rather superintendents of it. The witness testimony about which type is in reproductive biological need is actually somewhat clearer than you might expect. In accounts where witnesses receive explicit communication about the purpose of the hybridization program, the communication consistently frames the biological need as belonging to the operational grays, the ones whose biology is being hybridized with human material. The tall gray, when it explains the program, typically describes it in a way that places the small beings as the party in need of genetic renewal. It positions itself as the explainer and, in some accounts, as the authority overseeing the program, but not as a participant in the biological process. This framing, consistent across multiple accounts from unconnected witnesses, would be precisely what you would expect if the two types are biologically distinct species and the hybridization program is specifically about the biological situation of Type 1, with Type 2 present in the role of overseer or sponsor. The hybridization program also provides some bearing on the timeline of the gray presence near Earth. If the program requires multiple generations of refinement to move from failing early hybrids to viable later ones, and if the encounter record reflects a genuine progression in hybrid viability over time, from the fragile beings described in 1960s and 1970s accounts to the more viable beings described in 1990s and 2000s accounts, then the program has been actively running for at least the duration of the modern encounter era, 60 to 80 years. Some witnesses, however, describe being told that the program is much older than this, with references to multiple generations of human lineages being involved across centuries or millennia. If the program is genuinely ancient, this has implications for how we understand the gray presence near Earth. These beings are not visitors who arrived recently. They have been engaged with human biology for a very long time. If the program is ancient and has been running across human generations, then the distinction between Type 1 and Type 2, if it reflects genuine species-level biological difference, must also be ancient. Two species with a long-standing operational relationship, one of which is engaged in a generational program involving human genetics, would have developed the behavioral and social structures observed in the encounter record over a very long time. The division of labor, the hierarchy, the role differentiation, these would not be recent developments. They would be as old as the program itself, embedded in the operational protocols of both types. This antiquity of the relationship, if real, raises a question that has not been adequately explored in the encounter literature. Is there any evidence of the gray presence in pre-modern human history that distinguishes the two types? Ancient accounts of non-human beings, in religious texts, in mythological traditions, in the detailed records of ancient civilizations, do not typically describe beings that match the gray phenotype precisely, but they do describe encounters with non-human intelligences that are organized hierarchically, with some beings performing operational roles and others holding knowledge and authority. The Anunnaki of Mesopotamian tradition, the Elohim of the Hebrew Bible, the various supernatural beings of the Hindu Vedic texts, all of these traditions describe non-human intelligences that operate in a hierarchical structure with functional differentiation between types. None of this is direct evidence for the gray two-type model in antiquity, but the structural similarity is consistent with a very long history of human contact with hierarchically organized non-human intelligences. The most specific pre-modern reference to the two-type distinction in the encounter literature comes from researcher Zecharia Sitchin, whose interpretations of Sumerian cuneiform texts proposed that the Anunnaki, described in those texts as divine beings who interacted with humanity, were extraterrestrial beings engaged in, among other things, genetic modification of pre-existing hominids to create workers. Sitchin's translations and interpretations are contested by mainstream sumerology, and his conclusions should not be accepted uncritically, but the structural parallel with the encounter testimony is striking. In Sitchin's reading of the Sumerian texts, there are divine beings of one kind who make decisions and communicate, and worker beings who carry out the decisions. If the Sumerian texts are, even partially, a record of genuine encounters with non-human intelligences, then the two-type structure may be documented in the earliest written records of human civilization. Whether or not this ancient connection is real, the hybridization program as described in the modern encounter record provides a set of biological boundary conditions for the species question. Whatever the two types are, one of them is biologically engaged with human genetics, and one is primarily present in a supervisory and communicative role. The biologically engaged type is the smaller one. The supervisor is the taller one. This asymmetry, applied to the biology of hybridization, is most naturally interpreted as either a caste-differentiated single species whose workers conduct the biological program while the directors manage it, or as two distinct species in which one is the subject of a biological renewal program, and the other is its architect. The second interpretation is the one that the communication testimony supports most directly, but the first cannot be ruled out on biological grounds alone. There is one more dimension of the hybridization program that bears on the species question and that has been consistently underemphasized in the literature: the hybrid beings themselves. If the program is real and has been running for decades, there should be, by now, a significant population of hybrid individuals. Some witnesses describe being shown rooms full of hybrid children or encountering adult hybrids who appear to be living aboard craft or in some kind of permanent facility. These descriptions are among the most vivid in the encounter record, and they are also among the most difficult to evaluate, because by the witnesses' own accounts, the hybrid beings they encounter are designed to be difficult to distinguish from unusual-looking humans. The relevance to the species question is this: the described hybrids are described as having human and gray characteristics, but witnesses consistently report that the gray characteristics present in the hybrids are those of type 1, not type 2. The hybrids have the enlarged eyes, the thin limbs, the smooth, pale skin, the reduced nose and mouth of the small grays, not the taller stature and the more defined features of the tall grays. If the hybridization program is combining human and type 1 genetics, and if the hybrids reflect the genetic input of both sources, then the absence of type 2 characteristics in the hybrids is biological evidence that type 2 is not contributing genetic material to the program. Type 2, in the hybridization biology, is absent. Its genetics are not being mixed with human genetics. Only type 1 genetics are. This is one of the strongest biological arguments for the two-species model available in the encounter record. If the two types were the same species, you would expect hybrids to show characteristics drawn from the full range of that species' morphological variation, including the characteristics of the taller type. The fact that the hybrids described by witnesses consistently show type 1 characteristics and not type 2 characteristics is most parsimoniously explained by type 1 and type 2 being biologically distinct, with the hybridization program involving only one of them. The competing frameworks, alternative theories, and what they get right. The discussion so far has been organized primarily around the binary of single species versus two species, with the manufactured type 1 hypothesis emerging as a third possibility with significant support in the testimony record. But the encounter phenomenon, and the question of the two gray types specifically, has attracted a much wider range of theoretical frameworks than this binary suggests. Some of these frameworks are radical departures from the extraterrestrial biological entity model entirely. Others are refinements within that model. All of them deserve examination because each captures something about the encounter phenomenon that the straightforward two-species or single-species model struggles to account for. The first alternative framework worth examining is Jacques Vallée's interdimensional or ultraterrestrial hypothesis. Vallée, drawing on decades of cross-cultural encounter research and frustrated by the inconsistencies and absurdities he found in many encounter accounts, proposed that the beings responsible for close encounters are not biological organisms traveling through space from another star system. They are intelligences that originate from somewhere else, a different dimension, a different layer of reality, a different temporal locus, that manifest in our perceptual environment in forms our minds can process, which inevitably means forms that look like living organisms, because our brains have no other template for encountering an intelligence. The grays, in this framework, are a mask. They are the form that a genuinely alien intelligence, alien not in the sense of coming from another planet, but alien in the deeper sense of being categorically outside human ontology, wears when it interacts with human witnesses. Vallée's framework elegantly resolves many of the inconsistencies in the encounter record. It explains why the encounters have a dreamlike, logic-defying quality in many accounts. It explains why the beings are described as capable of passing through solid walls and operating in ways that violate normal physical laws. It explains why encounter accounts throughout history have produced different images of the non-human intelligence, gods, demons, fairies, gnomes, space brothers, greys, while maintaining structural similarities between those images because the intelligence is always the same, but the form it takes is generated by the witnessing culture's available imagery. For the two-type question, Vallée's framework produces a specific and interesting answer. The distinction between type 1 and type 2 might not be a biological distinction at all. It might be a functional distinction in how the intelligence chooses to present itself. Type 1, the impersonal, operational, drone-like worker, represents the intelligence in its most purely functional mode, stripped of any pretense at communication or relationship. Type 2, the taller, more individualized communicating presence, represents the intelligence in a mode specifically designed for human contact, wearing a form that is recognizably similar to type 1, but differentiated enough to signal elevated status and communicative purpose. This is not a biological distinction, it is a presentation distinction. Two masks worn by the same underlying intelligence for different purposes. The consistency of the distinction across global encounter reports in this framework reflects the consistency of the intelligence's approach to its two primary modes of human interaction, operational and communicative. The intelligence is consistent in how it presents these modes, not because the biology is consistent, but because the operational logic is consistent. There is much that is compelling about this framework. It handles the physics violations, it handles the dreamlike quality, it handles the historical variation in how non-human intelligences are perceived across cultures. But for the specific question of the two gray types, it has a weakness. It cannot explain the physical trace evidence. If both types are presentations of the same non-biological intelligence, they should not produce different physical effects in the bodies of witnesses. But the differential physical effects discussed in Part 5, different neurological and physiological aftermath profiles for witnesses who describe primarily type 1 encounters versus those who describe primarily type 2 encounters, suggest that the distinction between the types has physical consequences that are not consistent with both types being equally non-physical manifestations of the same intelligence. The second major alternative framework is John Keel's concept of the ultraterrestrials, beings that are not from another planet, but from the same planet, indigenous to Earth in some sense that predates or transcends the emergence of human civilization. Keel's ultraterrestrials are not strictly biological either, but they are more persistently engaged with Earth's physical environment than Valley's interdimensional intelligences. They have been here always. They occupy the same physical space as humanity, but in a mode of existence that is normally invisible to human perception. Close encounters occur when the veil between their mode of existence and ours becomes temporarily permeable, and witnesses perceive them in whatever form their perceptual apparatus generates for the contact experience. Keel's framework generates a different answer to the two-type question. If the beings are indigenous to Earth and have always been here, the two types might represent two different categories of these indigenous beings, different populations, or different functional subtypes of an intelligence that has been here since before humanity. The hierarchical relationship between them would reflect an ancient social structure native to Earth, not the product of interstellar travel or genetic engineering. The encounter experience in this model is not alien contact in the extraterrestrial sense. It is contact with the native intelligence of the planet, mediated by the same perceptual filters that have always shaped human encounters with the non-human. Keel's framework has the virtue of not requiring interstellar travel, which is the biggest physical challenge for the extraterrestrial hypothesis. But it shares with Valley's framework the weakness of struggling to account for the physical consistency of the encounters and the specific biological detail in the witness accounts. Indigenous non-biological intelligences would not need to collect genetic material. They would not need to conduct reproductive procedures. They would not produce hybrids with human genetic characteristics. The entire biological program aspect of the encounter record makes most sense within a biological framework, not an interdimensional or indigenous intelligence framework. The third major alternative framework is the psychological or neurological hypothesis that close encounters with gray beings are generated entirely within the human mind, either by natural neurological processes or by as yet unidentified external influences on brain function. This hypothesis encompasses several specific mechanisms. Sleep paralysis, with its documented tendency to produce experiences of presence, of menacing figures, and of inability to move, has been proposed as an explanation for bedroom abduction experiences. Temporal lobe activity, with its known capacity to generate vivid experiences of entities, communication, and cosmic significance, has been proposed as a mechanism for the communication content of encounters. Trauma and dissociation, with their capacity to produce elaborate internal narratives, have been proposed as mechanisms for the sustained abduction experience. None of these mechanisms, individually, adequately explains the encounter phenomenon. Sleep paralysis does not explain encounters that occur in moving vehicles, in open fields, or in groups where multiple witnesses share the same experience. Temporal lobe activity explains some features of individual encounter experiences, but does not account for the physical trace evidence or the cross-cultural consistency. Trauma and dissociation might explain individual responses to encounters, but do not explain what the initial traumatic event was. There is, however, a version of the neurological hypothesis that is more sophisticated and more difficult to dismiss. The hypothesis that an external intelligence, biological, physical, and real, is deliberately inducing altered neurological states in human witnesses as a mechanism for conducting the encounter. In this model, the beings are physically real, but they interact with human witnesses primarily by manipulating human neurology rather than by conducting physical procedures in the ordinary physical sense. The experience of the encounter is real, but the physical procedures experienced may be neurological rather than biological. The paralysis, the examination, the reproductive procedures, all of this may be happening at the level of the nervous system rather than the body. This version of the hypothesis does not resolve the two-type question, but places it in a different context. Both types would be physically real beings with the capacity to manipulate human neurological experience. The difference between them would still be behavioral and potentially biological, but the nature of their engagement with human witnesses would be fundamentally neurological rather than physical. The different types of effects on witnesses, the physical tissue evidence for encounters involving type 1, the neurological and electromagnetic effects for encounters involving type 2, would reflect the different neurological tools each type employs, not necessarily differences in what each type physically does to the human body. There is a fourth framework that deserves serious examination and has gained significant traction in recent years among researchers who are neither uncritical believers nor reflexive skeptics. The consciousness technology hypothesis, sometimes associated with researchers like Diana Pasulka. This framework proposes that what we call the gray phenomenon is real, but that its reality is something more complex than biological organisms from another star system. The beings are real, but they may be the product of a technology so advanced that the distinction between biological and artificial, between natural and engineered, has become meaningless. The small grays might be what an intelligence produces when it has mastered biology completely, beings that are neither alive in the way we understand life, nor dead in the way we understand death, but something categorically different that our conceptual vocabulary is not equipped to handle. In this framework, the two-type distinction reflects the different manifestations of a single advanced intelligence at different levels of abstraction from that intelligence's core. Type 2 might be closer to the intelligence itself, a manifestation that retains something of individual personality, of purposive thought, of the quality of a mind that has goals and history and perspective. Type 1 might be further from the intelligence's core, a manifestation optimized for physical operations, stripped of the overhead of individual personality, because personality is an adaptation for social life, and these beings are not operating socially, they are operating instrumentally. This framework is philosophically interesting and potentially productive, but it generates the same empirical problems for the species question that the other alternative frameworks generate. It does not make specific predictions that can be tested against the encounter record in a way that would distinguish it from the biological two-species model. Both the two-species biological model and the consciousness technology model predict the same basic observable pattern, two types of beings with different behavioral profiles. The mechanisms underlying that pattern are what differ, and those mechanisms are not accessible to the kind of observation and inference available through the encounter record. Among all the alternative frameworks, the one that most directly challenges the straightforward two-species biological model while remaining within a broadly materialist, physically real interpretation of the encounter phenomenon is the idea that the tall grays are human, not human in the sense of being present-day Homo sapiens, but human in the sense of being the far future descendants of a human or human-adjacent lineage that has traveled back in time or forward from another temporal location into our present. This is the ultra-terrestrial variant in its temporal form, and it has been advanced in various formulations by researchers, including Mactonis, Emery Smith, and several others. The temporal variant of the two-type model says this: the tall grays are what humanity, or a successor lineage, becomes after millions of years of cognitive evolution and technological development. The large brain, the reduced body, the vestigial sensory organs, the emphasis on telepathic communication over verbal language, these are the characteristics of a species that has undergone exactly the kind of evolutionary trajectory outlined in Part 2. They are us, long changed, and the small grays are their servants or constructs, manufactured by a future intelligence so advanced that it can design biological organisms the way we currently design software. The implications of this framework for the species question are profound. It would mean that the two types are not separate species, but separate points on a single evolutionary timeline, Type 2 being the evolved intelligence, Type 1 being its manufactured tool. They are not cousins. One is the creator and the other is the created, and the human beings encountering them are the ancestors of one of them, being studied and possibly shaped by their own descendants. This model has a certain elegance that the simple extraterrestrial model lacks. It explains why the beings are so interested in human genetics. They are invested in it because it is their own genetic line. It explains why they appear to have deep knowledge of human psychology. They have had millions of years to study it. It explains why the communication from the tall beings carries emotional weight that witnesses experience as genuine, as though this intelligence has a personal stake in the encounter. It does. It has the most personal stake possible. But the temporal model has serious physical problems. Time travel of the kind it requires is not supported by any established physics, though it is also not definitively ruled out by established physics. It produces paradoxes that are difficult to reason around. And it does not obviously explain why the encounter phenomenon appears to have operated consistently for at least the duration of human recorded history, which would require either an extraordinarily long-running temporal intervention or multiple independent programs of temporal contact. None of these alternative frameworks definitively answers the species question. Each illuminates something and obscures something. What the survey of alternative frameworks tells us is that the question itself is more open than it initially appears. The two-species biological model, while well supported by the encounter evidence, is not the only model consistent with that evidence. The encounter phenomenon may be stranger than two biological species from the same or different star systems. It may require conceptual frameworks that we do not yet have. But within the limits of what can be said based on the available evidence, the best supported model remains the one that takes the physical descriptions and behavioral patterns at face value and asks what biology they imply. And that model, as we have argued throughout, points toward a distinction between the two gray types that is biological rather than merely social, significant rather than trivial, and consistent with either two distinct species in an operational relationship or a single species that has manufactured a second biological type for its own purposes. The next part of this documentary will bring these threads together and evaluate the cumulative evidence. The disclosure era, recent developments and what they add to the picture. The landscape of official and public acknowledgement of the UFO phenomenon has changed dramatically in the period between 2017 and the present. What was, for 7 decades, a subject treated by governments and mainstream institutions as either non-existent or beneath serious consideration, has, in a relatively short period, been acknowledged at the highest levels of multiple governments as representing real, unexplained phenomena with national security implications. This shift in the official posture does not resolve the question of what these phenomena are. It does not confirm the existence of biological non-human entities of any description, but it changes the epistemic context in which the question of the short and tall grays is being asked, and it introduces new evidence and new complexity that must be incorporated into any current assessment. The shift began publicly with the release of 3 Navy gun camera videos by the New York Times in December 2017, videos that showed unidentified aerial phenomena displaying flight characteristics inconsistent with any known human aerospace technology. The Pentagon's subsequent confirmation of the video's authenticity and the establishment of the UAPTF, the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force, marked the beginning of a period of grudging but accelerating official engagement with a subject that had been officially ignored for decades. The National Intelligence Authorization Act of 2021 mandated a formal UAP report from the Director of National Intelligence, which was delivered to Congress in June 2021. That report confirmed the reality of the unexplained aerial phenomena, noted their potential national security implications, and was conspicuously silent on the question of their ultimate origin. The most significant development for our purposes came in 2023, with the congressional testimony of David Grush, discussed in Part 4, and the subsequent hearings that included testimony from active duty military personnel describing their own UAP encounters. The hearings, conducted by the House Oversight Committee's National Security Subcommittee, represented the most extensive congressional engagement with the UAP subject in American history. Grush's testimony specifically included claims about non-human intelligence and non-human biological material delivered under oath by a credentialed intelligence official with professional knowledge of the programs he was describing. What the 2023 hearings added to the species question is primarily indirect, procedural rather than substantive. No witness at those hearings described the physical details of non-human entities in terms that would distinguish between the two gray types. The classified sessions that accompanied the public hearings have not been publicly disclosed in enough detail to be evaluated. But the mere fact that these hearings occurred, that the government did not immediately move to discredit the witnesses, and that the institutional framework for managing UAP information has been restructuring itself in visible ways since 2017, suggests that the underlying reality being managed is more complex and more substantive than a simple case of misidentified natural phenomena. The accelerating disclosure environment has also produced a renewed intensity of activity in the civilian research community, with a new generation of researchers applying more rigorous methodological standards to the encounter record than was typical in earlier decades. Organizations like MUFON continue to accumulate case reports, but they have been joined by academic adjacent institutions like the Galileo Project at Harvard, led by physicist Avi Loeb, which applies the methods and standards of empirical science to the search for evidence of non-human technology and intelligence. Loeb's project does not focus specifically on the biological entity question. Its primary concern is with the materials and physics of UAP. But its methodological approach, which requires repeatable evidence and explicit hypothesis testing, represents a new standard for the field. For the specific question of the gray types, the disclosure era has produced one development that is underappreciated in its significance: the increased frequency and specificity of testimony from former and current military personnel who claim to have had direct encounters with non-human entities in official military contexts. These accounts, which come from people with security clearances, chain of command reporting structures, and institutional stakes in their own credibility, are subject to different pressures than civilian testimony. They are less likely to be fabricated for attention or financial gain. The institutional costs of making false claims in a military context are substantial, but they may be shaped by classification obligations and by the military informational environment in ways that make them unreliable in other directions. Several of these accounts, given in various settings over the past decade, describe entities that map onto the two-type distinction. A former Navy intelligence officer, speaking at a UAP hearing in 2023 under conditions of partial anonymity, described an encounter described to him by colleagues that involved beings of two distinct sizes, one group performing what he called sensor activities, and another, taller, being present in an apparent supervisory capacity. He declined to elaborate on the physical descriptions, citing classification concerns, but the structural distinction he described, a group of operational beings and a separate, taller supervisory presence, is precisely the Type 1, Type 2 distinction in military language, rather than the vocabulary of abduction research. A former Air Force technical specialist claimed in a recorded interview conducted by researcher Linda Moulton Howe in 2021 to have been part of a team that transported biological material associated with non-human entities, material she described as falling into two distinct categories that her team was instructed to handle according to separate protocols. She did not describe having seen the entities themselves, but the two-category distinction in the biological material she described handling, material from smaller beings, and material from what she described as a larger different type, is consistent with the two-type pattern in the broader evidence record. These military and intelligence-adjacent accounts do not resolve the species question, but they do something important. They indicate that whatever the institutional knowledge is about the entities, that knowledge reflects the same two-type structure that the civilian encounter record documents. If the official programs that manage UAP information have developed classification protocols that distinguish between two categories of non-human biological material, it is because their analysis of that material led them to a classification scheme. A single species would produce a single category of biological material. Two protocols suggest two categories. Two categories suggest two sources. The disclosure era has also brought renewed attention to a body of testimony that predates the current period, but that has become more accessible and more widely known as the research community has grown. the accounts of alleged participants in what some researchers call the black programs, the most deeply classified programs within the UAP management structure. These accounts are the most difficult to evaluate of any in the field because the classification levels they describe are, by design, beyond any verification mechanism available to civilian researchers. But their consistency with the broader evidence record is notable, and in some cases, their specific claims about the two gray types represent the most detailed information available from any source. One account that has circulated in the research community for several decades, attributed to a source known only by the designation "the doctor," a medical professional who claimed to have been involved in biological examination of recovered non-human entities, describes in detail the biological differences between two types of recovered beings. The account, first reported by researcher Bill Hamilton in the late 1980s and subsequently referenced by multiple other researchers who claim to have independently encountered the same or similar source material, describes the smaller beings as having a cellular biology that is strikingly different from the larger beings at the level of fundamental cell structure. The account claims that the smaller beings have cells that function more like mechanical components than like the adaptive, metabolically active cells of naturally evolved organisms, a description that is consistent with the engineered organism hypothesis for type 1. The larger beings, in this account, have cells that are recognizably biological in the conventional sense, adaptive, metabolically active, exhibiting the kind of variability that characterizes living tissue in natural organisms. The account describes this difference as having been deeply puzzling to the medical personnel who examined the entities, because two beings so similar in outward appearance should not have such different fundamental biology. The conclusion reached by the examining team, as described in this account, was that the smaller beings were not naturally evolved organisms, but manufactured ones, biological constructs created by the larger beings or by some process associated with the larger beings. This account is extraordinary, if true. It would represent direct institutional confirmation of the manufactured type 1 hypothesis, arrived at through physical biological examination rather than inference from witness testimony. It would definitively answer the species question: not one species, not two naturally evolved species, but one natural species and one manufactured biological construct. It would mean that the tall grays are the natural intelligence and that the short grays are, in the most literal sense possible, their creation. The problems with this account are the usual problems of the whistleblower category: unverifiable source, unknown chain of custody, potential for fabrication or manipulation, and the impossibility of independent confirmation. The account has survived in the research literature for more than 30 years without being discredited or corroborated with new evidence. It exists in the liminal zone of things that cannot be dismissed but cannot be confirmed, which is where most of the most significant evidence in this field resides. What the disclosure era has demonstrated, above all, is that the institutional knowledge about non-human intelligences is more developed than was publicly acknowledged for decades. The programs that Grush and other whistleblowers describe are not programs that deal with distant, uncertain, theoretically possible contact. They are programs that deal with material and entities that have been recovered, analyzed, and classified at the highest levels of government secrecy. Whatever conclusions those programs have reached about the nature and relationship of the beings they have been studying remain classified. But the disclosure era has made it harder to maintain the position that there is nothing to hide. And in making that position harder to maintain, it has shifted the default assumption in the direction of the witnesses that what they have been describing for 80 years has some relationship to physical reality. For the two-type question specifically, the disclosure era has introduced no single piece of evidence that resolves it definitively, but it has added a layer of institutional corroboration, fragmentary, classified, and frustratingly opaque, to the civilian encounter record. The two-type pattern that appears in thousands of civilian testimonies across 8 decades also appears in the oblique language of people bound by security constraints, in the accounts of those who claim institutional knowledge. If the civilian record had a specific artifact of cultural contamination or mass psychology that was producing the two-type pattern, It would not also appear in the accounts of people operating in classified programs with no stake in aligning their accounts with civilian UFO culture. It remains for the final sections of this documentary to synthesize the accumulated evidence, confront the strongest counterarguments, and reach as honest a conclusion as the available evidence permits. Weighing the scales, a synthesis of the evidence. We have covered a great deal of ground, and it is time to bring the threads together into a coherent assessment. The question before us, are short grays and tall grays the same species, has been examined from the perspectives of biology, behavioral analysis, whistleblower testimony, physical trace evidence, communication content, global distribution, hybridization biology, alternative theoretical frameworks, and the emerging context of the disclosure era. Each of these perspectives has contributed something to the answer, and none of them has been sufficient on its own to resolve the question definitively. What we now need to do is weigh the cumulative evidence honestly, acknowledge its limitations, and arrive at the most defensible conclusion the available information supports. Let us begin by laying out what the evidence establishes with reasonable confidence before addressing what remains uncertain. The first thing the evidence establishes with reasonable confidence is that the two-type distinction in the encounter record is real. By real, we mean that it is not an artifact of cultural contamination, not a product of researcher suggestion in hypnotic regression, and not a simple variation within a single pattern that is being artificially divided into two categories. The evidence for this comes from multiple independent sources. The cross-cultural consistency of the pattern across populations with minimal access to North American UFO culture, the presence of the distinction in cases that predate the cultural template from which contamination would have to come, the differential physical effects on witnesses that correlate with which type they predominantly encountered, and the appearance of the distinction in military and intelligence-adjacent accounts from sources with no apparent motive to adopt civilian encounter mythology. The two-type distinction is real. Something is producing two physically and behaviorally distinct entities in the encounter record, and that something is not simply cultural imagination. The second thing the evidence establishes with reasonable confidence is that the behavioral distinction between the two types is systematic, not incidental. Type 1 consistently performs physical operations. Type 2 consistently communicates and directs. This is not a coincidence in the data. It is a pattern that appears in encounter after encounter across decades and geographies in accounts gathered by different researchers using different methodologies. The systematic nature of the behavioral distinction tells us that whatever organizational logic governs the relationship between the two types is stable and consistent. It does not vary by region, by period, or by the individual characteristics of specific encounters. This stability strongly suggests that the behavioral distinction is structurally embedded in the relationship between the two types, not a situational variation. The third thing the evidence establishes with reasonable confidence is that the two types are not interchangeable. This is a stronger claim than merely saying they have different roles. Interchangeable would mean that the same entity could, under different circumstances, perform either role. The evidence does not support this. Type 1 beings are never described in the roles characteristic of Type 2. They do not communicate, they do not direct, they do not show the individualized presence or the evidence of a reasoning, purposive mind that witnesses consistently attribute to Type 2. Conversely, Type 2 beings are never described performing the physical operational tasks characteristic of Type 1. The non-interchangeability suggests that the difference between the types is fundamental, not situational. From these three established points, what can we infer about the single versus double species question? The inference is constrained, but it can be made. A single species model that could account for all three established points would need to posit a biological caste system with three specific properties. First, the caste system would need to produce non-interchangeable morphological and cognitive subtypes, beings that are genuinely different in fundamental ways, not just assigned different roles. Second, the caste system would need to operate consistently across whatever range of conditions these beings encounter. stable enough that the behavioral distinction never breaks down even in the range of encounter scenarios represented in the global record. Third, the cognitive differentiation between the castes would need to be as profound as the evidence suggests, specifically the absence in Type 1 of anything resembling the individual personality, purposive reasoning, and emotional responsiveness present in Type 2. A caste system with these three properties is theoretically possible, but represents a degree of biological differentiation that goes significantly beyond anything seen in terrestrial eusocial organisms. The cognitive differentiation in particular, the complete absence in Type 1 of the properties that define Type 2 as an agent with will and purpose, would require that the two castes are operating at fundamentally different levels of what we would call consciousness. This is not strictly impossible, but it is a very strong claim about what natural selection or deliberate genetic engineering could produce within a single species. The two-species model accounts for all three established points more parsimoniously. Non-interchangeable types are expected if they are separate species, because their biological architectures are independently optimized rather than sharing a common genetic foundation. Stable behavioral distinction across conditions is expected if the behaviors reflect deep biological difference rather than social role assignment. And the profound cognitive differentiation is less problematic if the two types are separate species with separate evolutionary histories, because evolution could have produced the properties we see in Type 2: individual reasoning, purposive agency, emotional responsiveness, without producing them in a separately evolved or separately manufactured Type 1. The manufactured Type 1 hypothesis, the claim that Type 1 is a biological construct created by Type 2, handles all of the same considerations as the two-species model, and additionally explains several specific features of the evidence. The complete absence of emotional responsiveness in Type 1 is easier to explain as a design feature than as an evolved absence. The systematic non-interchangeability is what you expect from a designed tool, not from a naturally evolved social partner. The absence of Type 2 morphological characteristics in hybrid beings, which was identified in Part 8 as one of the strongest biological arguments for Type 2 not contributing genetic material to the hybridization program, is consistent with Type 2 being the architect of a program that involves Type 1's genetics rather than its own, and the communication content from witnesses who receive information about the relationship between the two types. The consistent framing of the small beings as made rather than born is the most direct testimony available and points specifically to the manufactured hypothesis. The manufactured Type 1 hypothesis is therefore the most parsimonious explanation of the total evidence. It does not require us to posit two separately evolved species that happen to share an operational context and a hierarchical relationship. It does not require us to posit a degree of biological caste differentiation within a single species that exceeds what biology has demonstrably produced anywhere on Earth. It requires us to posit one naturally evolved intelligence, the tall gray, that has at some point in its very long history mastered biological engineering to the degree that it can create functional biological entities for operational purposes. This is an extraordinary claim, but it is less extraordinarily specific than the alternatives. A civilization that is millions of years more technologically advanced than humanity, with mastery of biology that we can only begin to imagine, producing specialized biological tools for its operations, is a claim consistent with a linear extrapolation of what technology does to the relationship between intelligence and biology. We are already beginning to do this ourselves at a primitive level with genetic engineering. The tall gray's presumed level of biological engineering capability would be the logical product of millions of additional years of development along this trajectory. There is a counter-argument to the manufactured hypothesis that deserves serious engagement. If Type 1 beings are manufactured constructs, biological tools, rather than naturally evolved organisms, then the degree of complexity they exhibit is enormous for a tool. They navigate three-dimensional space, operate complex instruments, physically manage resistant human subjects, and coordinate complex multi-step procedures in real time. Tools of this complexity are, in our current engineering vocabulary, indistinguishable from agents. They exhibit flexible, context-sensitive behavior that is the hallmark of intelligence, not of simple mechanism. Can you manufacture something this complex and have it remain a tool rather than becoming, in some meaningful sense, a being? This is a genuine philosophical problem, and it cuts to the heart of what we mean by the distinction between tool and being, between manufactured and natural, between alive and not alive. It is possible that the manufactured hypothesis, if correct, requires us to revise our understanding of these distinctions as profoundly as the discovery of non-human intelligence itself would require us to revise our understanding of consciousness and purpose. A manufactured being complex enough to perform the tasks attributed to Type 1 might be, by most functional definitions, genuinely alive and genuinely conscious, even if its consciousness was designed and installed rather than evolved. The tall gray creating the small one would then be not a manufacturer of tools, but a creator of beings, something rather closer to what our own traditions have called God. The theological implications of this possibility are not something this documentary will pursue in detail, but they are worth naming because they are present. If the manufactured hypothesis is correct, the tall grays have done something that, in the history of human thought, has been reserved for the divine. They have created life. And the encounter testimony, in its reports of the relationship between the two types, carries all the ambiguity and power of that creative act. The tension between the creator's detachment and the created thing's existence, between the engineering of a tool and the birth of a being. There is one more piece of evidence that bears on the synthesis, and it has been building throughout this documentary without being named explicitly. It concerns not what the evidence says about the two types, but what it says about their relationship to us. If Type 2 is the naturally evolved intelligence, and if it is indeed millions of years more advanced than humanity, then its presence near Earth and its engagement with human genetics is not a casual or incidental thing. It represents a commitment of resources and attention from an intelligence of enormous sophistication and enormous historical depth. Whatever this intelligence wants from its engagement with humanity, it wants it enough to maintain the engagement across centuries at minimum and possibly across millennia. That persistence suggests that the stakes are high, for them, not just for us. And if Type 1 is manufactured by Type 2, then the deployment of Type 1 in direct contact with human witnesses is also a deliberate choice. Type 2 could, presumably, conduct whatever operations it is conducting directly, without the labor of a manufactured biological workforce. The choice to use Type 1 for the physical operations and to reserve Type 2 for communication suggests a deliberate separation of function that serves some purpose beyond mere efficiency. Perhaps it protects Type 2 from the risks of direct physical contact. Perhaps it creates a buffer between the designing intelligence and the subjects of its program, a buffer that manages human perception and human response to the program. Perhaps the manufactured beings are genuinely better suited to the physical tasks, having been designed for them in ways that Type 2 was not. Or perhaps the separation is symbolic or psychological, a way of maintaining a relationship with humanity that is mediated rather than direct, with Type 2 as the face of a program that it is not willing to reveal fully. These are speculations, but they are speculations grounded in the evidence, and they point toward an understanding of the two-type distinction that is richer and stranger than either the simple same species or simple two-species model initially suggests. The relationship between the short grays and the tall grays is, on the best available evidence, the relationship between a designed intelligence and its designer, between a manufactured being and the mind that manufactured it, between an instrument of a program and the intelligence that conceived the program. And humanity, in this reading, is neither the designed nor the designer. It is the subject, the reckoning, conclusions, implications, and what comes next. We have spent 11 parts examining the evidence bearing on one of the most profound questions that can be asked about the encounter phenomenon. Are the short grays and the tall grays the same species? We have examined that question from every angle the available evidence permits. We have been honest about the epistemological problems. We have not oversold the testimony or undersold the physical evidence. We have taken seriously both the skeptical critique and the accounts of the witnesses, and we have tried to follow the evidence wherever it leads without letting either cultural resistance or cultural enthusiasm determine the destination. It is time to say what the evidence, taken as a whole, most plausibly supports. The evidence most plausibly supports the conclusion that short grays and tall grays are not the same species. More specifically, it supports the conclusion that they are not even in the same biological category, that what we call the short gray is not a naturally evolved organism at all, but a designed biological entity created by the intelligence we call the tall gray. The two-type distinction is real, systematic, and fundamental. It reflects a difference in origin, in nature, and in fundamental biology that is most parsimoniously explained, not by natural evolution producing two distinct species, not by a single species producing two differentiated castes, but by one intelligence having created another kind of being for its operational purposes. This conclusion is supported by the convergence of multiple independent evidence streams. The behavioral non-interchangeability of the two types supports it. Beings that cannot exchange roles are not organized by social assignment but by fundamental difference. The complete absence of emotional responsiveness in Type 1 supports it. A naturally evolved social being, or even a biologically differentiated caste of a social species, would retain some vestige of the emotional architecture that social life requires, unless that architecture had been deliberately removed by design. The communication content in which Type 2 beings describe the small ones as made rather than born supports it. Testimony directly from the beings themselves, however epistemologically fraught, consistently points toward this conclusion. The hybridization biology supports it. The hybrids described in the encounter records show Type 1 characteristics, not Type 2 characteristics, because only Type 1 genetics are being combined with human genetics, and only Type 1's genetics are in biological need of the renewal the program is designed to provide. The whistleblower testimony describing the cellular biology of the two types as fundamentally different in ways consistent with one being manufactured and one being natural supports it. Each of these evidence streams individually is insufficient, all of them together pointing in the same direction from independent sources using independent methods, producing consistent findings across decades and cultures. This convergence is the best available guide to the truth. What does this conclusion mean? What are its implications, and not just for the academic question of alien taxonomy, but for our understanding of who and what we are encountering, and what our encounter with them means? The first implication is about the nature of the intelligence we are dealing with. If the tall grays are a naturally evolved intelligence that has mastered the engineering of life, then we are in the presence of a being whose technological and scientific capability is so far beyond ours that the gap is not a matter of degree but of kind. We can engineer at the genetic level. We can produce organisms with modified traits. What the manufactured Type 1 hypothesis requires is the capacity to design and build a functional, complex, intelligent biological entity from first principles, not modifying an existing organism, but creating a new kind of being. This is not an extension of what we currently do. It is something categorically different. It suggests a relationship to biology that is, by our standards, absolute. Complete understanding, complete control, complete creative capacity. A civilization with this relationship to biology would also have a relationship to its own biology that is completely different from ours. It would not be subject to the biological limitations that constrain human life and human civilization. Disease, aging, the imperfection of the evolved body, these would be manageable, modifiable, potentially eliminable by a civilization that can design biological systems from scratch. The tall grays in this picture are not just more advanced than us. They are more advanced than us in the specific domain that most constrains what we can be and what we can do. The second implication is about what they want from us. The encounter testimony, however uncertain in its details, consistently describes a program of engagement with human biology that has been running for a very long time. If the tall grays have manufactured the short ones, they have demonstrated that they can create biological entities when they want to. They do not need to hybridize with human genetics because they cannot produce what they need. They can produce what they need. The hybridization program, from this perspective, is not a program of desperation. It is a program of choice. They are choosing to engage with human genetics. The reasons for this choice, which may include curiosity, scientific interest in human genetic diversity, the creation of beings that bridge two biological architectures, or purposes more complex than any of these, are not transparent from the encounter record. But the fact that it is a choice made by a being with full biological engineering capability makes it more meaningful and more purposeful than a program driven by necessity. The choice to engage specifically with human genetics, rather than with the genetics of any other species on Earth, requires explanation. It is not enough to say that humans are the most cognitively complex species available and therefore the most interesting research subject. The tall grays, if their civilizational history is as old as the encounter testimony suggests, would have encountered and cataloged the cognitive complexity of the human species long ago. Their sustained engagement with human genetics, specifically over decades or centuries of the modern encounter era and possibly much longer, suggests that human genetics offers something specific that draws their sustained attention. The most unsettling candidate for that something, suggested by multiple lines of evidence in the encounter record, is that human genetics contains something that even the tall grays, with all their biological mastery, find valuable and perhaps cannot replicate: the dynamic, diverse, evolutionarily active biology of a young species at the height of its adaptive capacity. If the tall grays' own biology has become too fixed, too highly optimized, too constrained by the very efficiency that makes it so powerful, then human genetics, messy and diverse and still evolving, might offer something they cannot manufacture. You can design an organism, you can select for specific traits, but you cannot manufacture biological unpredictability, cannot engineer genuine biological diversity in the way that emerges from a species still under active evolutionary pressure. If this is what they are after, the hybridization program is not about creating a new species to replace or supplement either grays or humans. It is about introducing biological dynamism back into a system that has become too ordered. This possibility has a strange and somewhat humbling implication for humanity's sense of its own significance. For most of human history, the question of whether we are alone in the universe has carried the implicit assumption that intelligence is the measure of significance, that if non-human intelligence exists and is more advanced than ours, we are the lesser party, and our significance in the universe is accordingly diminished. The evidence examined in this documentary suggests something different, that it may not be our intelligence that is our most significant property in the context of whatever is going on, but our biology, our genetic diversity, our biological dynamism, our evolutionary youth. These may be precisely what a very old, very advanced, very cognitively powerful intelligence finds interesting about us. Not our minds, but our bodies. Not what we think, but what we carry in our DNA. The third implication is about the nature of the encounter experience itself. If the beings conducting physical encounters with human subjects are manufactured organisms, beings designed for their tasks rather than evolved for them, then the experience of being examined by them, of being handled and sampled and physiologically manipulated by them, is an experience of interaction with something that is conscious in some sense, but not in the sense we usually mean by the word. It is an experience of being engaged with by a designed intelligence, one that has no inner life in the experiential sense that would register the witness as a person rather than a subject. This is, frankly, one of the most disturbing aspects of the manufactured hypothesis. The impersonality of Type 1, the quality that witnesses find most unsettling about the short beings, more than the strangeness of their appearance, is not a cultural distance or a cognitive difference or a failure of emotional translation across species. It is the correct behavior of a designed thing doing what it was designed to do. It does not respond to the witness as a person because it was not designed to respond to persons. It was designed to conduct biological procedures. The witness's experience of distress, terror, violation, None of this registers in the machinery of Type 1's behavior because there is no mechanism by which it could. There is nobody home in the relevant sense. There is a designed intelligence, capable and precise, and there is the task, and there is nothing else. If this is accurate, then the experience of being taken by the Greys, particularly the physical examination conducted by the Short Ones, is not an encounter between two conscious beings. It is an encounter between a conscious being and a sophisticated biological instrument. The instrument is used on the conscious being, and the experience of that use is one of the most intimate and violating possible, and the instrument does not know or care. This reading gives the abduction experience a different and in some ways darker character than the reading in which the Short Greys are simply alien and cold. Cold implies a temperature that could be warm. Designed implies an absence that could not be otherwise. The fourth implication is about our relationship to the Tall Greys, the intelligence behind the program, the designers of the instrument, the beings whose agenda structures the entire encounter phenomenon. If the Tall Greys are responsible for both the physical encounter program and the designed beings that carry it out, then our relationship to the Tall Greys is a relationship to something with comprehensive intentionality toward us. They are not passing through. They are not conducting a brief survey of a minor planet in a distant spiral arm. They have chosen to invest, and they have invested over a very long period, and whatever they are investing in involves the most intimate possible access to the human body and the human genetic code. Whether this investment is benevolent, malevolent, or simply indifferent to our categories of moral evaluation is one of the questions this documentary has deliberately not answered because the evidence does not resolve it. The communication content from the Tall Greys, as described by witnesses, includes assurances that the program is beneficial or necessary or part of something larger that serves interests that include human interests. But beings with the capacity to manufacture intelligence would also have the capacity to manufacture reassurance, to produce in human witnesses whatever emotional and cognitive response best serves their operational objectives. The fact that the Tall Greys communicate reassuringly does not mean what they are doing is reassuring. It means they have decided, for whatever reason, to communicate reassuringly. What we can say is that the Tall Greys appear to be operating with a degree of consistency and long-term commitment that suggests they are not impulsive or unpredictable. Their program, whatever it is, has a structure and a timeline that extends far beyond the normal human time horizon. They are patient in the way that only a very long-lived or collectively stable intelligence can be patient. And their engagement with humanity, however intimate and however disturbing in some of its aspects, appears to have been chosen and maintained rather than stumbled into. This is, in a strange way, potentially more reassuring than the alternative. If these beings are conducting a program with long-term structure, they are not going to abruptly change course. If they have maintained an operational relationship with humanity across what may be centuries or millennia, they are not about to terminate it. Whatever their agenda, it requires humanity's continued existence. That, at minimum, is a form of continuity we can note. The final implication is about what comes next, both for humanity and for our understanding of this phenomenon. The disclosure process underway is not yet complete. The institutional barriers to full transparency about what governments know regarding non-human intelligences are still in place, still reinforced by classification structures that have resisted decades of freedom of information requests and congressional pressure. But those barriers are visibly under strain in ways they were not 10 years ago. The testimony of credentialed intelligence officials under oath is a different kind of social and institutional force than civilian UFO reports, however consistent and however compelling. The direction of travel in official disclosure is toward more transparency, not less, even if the pace is frustratingly slow. When greater transparency comes, and on current trajectory, it will, the question of the two gray types will be among the first questions anyone with institutional knowledge will be asked to address. Because it is not an abstract taxonomic question, it is a question about the nature of the intelligence with which humanity has been in contact. Knowing that the short beings are manufactured by the tall ones changes everything about how we understand the encounter phenomenon. and by extension changes everything about how we understand our relationship to these intelligences and what that relationship means for our future. It changes the ethical framework of the encounter experience. If the beings conducting physical procedures on human witnesses are designed instruments rather than agents, then the moral responsibility for what is done to witnesses lies entirely with the designing intelligence. The small beings cannot be held morally responsible for what they do, any more than a scalpel can be held responsible for what a surgeon does with it. The tall greys, if they are responsible for the design and deployment of their instruments, are responsible for every procedure those instruments have ever conducted. The scale of that responsibility across decades of documented encounters involving thousands of witnesses is staggering. It changes the nature of the communication we might seek to establish. If the tall greys are the relevant intelligence, then communication should be directed toward them, and the encounter protocols that place human subjects in contact with the silent, impersonal short beings are not encounters with the intelligence, but with its tools. Any hope of genuine communication, of the kind that might lead to mutual understanding, to negotiated terms of engagement, to some form of consent structure for the biological program, requires reaching past the instruments to the intelligence that deploys them. And it changes the question we need to ask about what we are. If the tall greys have created one kind of being for their operational purposes, the encounter testimony raises the darkest and most persistent question in the whole field. Did they create another? The question of whether humanity itself is, in some sense, a designed or modified species, shaped by the same intelligence that appears to have shaped the short greys, is the most consequential and the most resistant to evidence of any question in this entire domain. The encounter testimony, as we noted in Part 6, occasionally carries hints of this possibility. The whistleblower testimony contains fragments that point toward it. The historical and mythological record, from the Sumerian creation texts to the traditions of multiple indigenous cultures describing beings who shaped humanity, provides context for taking the question seriously. We are not going to answer it here. We are going to name it because this documentary would be intellectually dishonest if it did not. If the tall greys have been manufacturing and modifying biological beings for millions of years, and if they have been engaged with human genetics for at least the duration of the modern encounter era, and if the encounter testimony and the whistleblower record both contain references to a much older engagement extending into the deep human past, then the question of whether human biology itself reflects the work of an intelligence beyond our own is not a question we can responsibly set aside. It is the question behind the question. Short greys and tall greys being different species or the same species is, in the end, a stepping stone. What we are really asking when we ask whether the intelligence that runs those encounters is the same kind of thing as the instruments it uses is, what kind of universe do we live in? Is this a universe in which intelligences can create other intelligences? Is this a universe in which biology is a technology and life is something that can be engineered? And if the answer to both of those questions is yes, then we have to ask, was our biology engineered? Were we? The evidence examined in this documentary does not answer that question, but it prepares us to ask it seriously. And that preparation, moving from the comfortable assumption that we are the only intelligence that has ever shaped this planet's biology, to the more vertigo-inducing possibility that we have ourselves been shaped, may be the most important intellectual transition that the encounter phenomenon requires of us. The short gray and the tall gray are not the same. They are not colleagues or cousins or castes. The most honest reading of the best available evidence is that one created the other, and the full weight of what that means, for them, for the encounter program, and for us, is something that humanity is only beginning to be equipped to confront. This documentary has been one small effort to build that equipment. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.